Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku's cell was just the command center of his mastermind scheme? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. It was bad enough that he'd been cooped up in the dorms for so long that he'd let shitty hair drag him to the mall, but then Deku just had to show up and start following him around like they were little kids again until he was sandwiched between Four Eyes and Round Face eating lunch like he was a part of their FNG class or something. Seriously? Katsuki glared across the table at Deku as he laughing and smiling with all the stupid but extras in his class. He thought he'd finally gotten rid of that demon nerd. Kirishima shot him a pleading look and Bakugo scoffed, but slumped down in his chair and stopped glaring at Deku. It wasn't that he was best friends with shitty hair or anything, but he was one of the only people that could take one of his explosions without flinching, so he'd earned a tiny speck of begrudging respect, which is more than those other extras had done. That's it. Speaking of those other extras, Raccoon Eyes had somehow roped that one detective from the USJ into joining them too, which wouldn't be too bad, except that something was going on between him and Deku and it was pissing Katsuki off. What right did that nerd have to act like he was friends with the detective? The police might not be as strong as heroes were, but they were still important, which meant that they were so far out of Deku's league that they may as well be on the moon. If it was some kind of hero worship thing like the nerd used to do with heroes, Katsuki would at least be able to understand it, but the problem was that the detective obviously knew Deku too. To make it even worse, there was some kind of weird tension between them, like they were sharing some sort of inside joke and laughing at Katsuki because he wasn't in the know. If it weren't for those stupid anger management classes that the defunct Hero Commission had forced him to go through, it would have been more than enough to make him explode. Katsuki didn't realize he'd started glaring at Deku again until Kirishima elbowed him and leaned over to mutter in his ear, "Why's Midoriya getting under your skin so much, man? He's really a nice guy." "He's not under my skin," Katsuki hissed back. "And he's a nuisance no matter how nice he is." Kirishima chuckled and shook his head. "Just play nice, man. Who knows? Maybe you guys can even be friends again. I was never that nerd's friend." Kirishima rolled his eyes and turned back to the conversation the class was having, which currently consisted of Ida scolding Siro for trying to use his tape to steal Tokoyami's fries. "You are preparing to be a hero. You should not use your quirk for frivolous pranks, regardless of whether or not public quirk usage has been legalized." "Oh, stealing fries is nothing." Raccoon Eyes grinned mischievously. "You should see some of the stuff Kaminari and I have pulled. It's insane." Four Eyes started scolding her instead and Katsuki couldn't help but notice that the weird tension between Deku and the detective still hadn't dissipated. If anything, it was somehow getting even stronger than it had been before Kirishima had distracted him. It was really pissing Katsuki off. If they didn't explain what was going on soon, Bakugo might just explode them both until they did. He scowled when he saw Deku texting someone under the table. If the nerd had to tag along with the class, something that Katsuki still hated, the least he could do was have the decency to pay attention to the extras that he was annoying with his presence. Deku didn't even try to look like he was paying attention after he put his phone away, instead choosing to have some kind of weird but staring contest with the detective. Katsuki was sick of it. Such pranks are entirely inappropriate. Four Eyes chopped his arms as Raccoon Eyes laughed. "Please tell me that you have not engaged in such activities since moving to the dorms?" "Oof, as much I'd like to do that, dude," Kaminari shrugged and grinned. "My quirk already fried all the brain cells I set aside for telling lies." The class erupted in laughter, with the exception of the detective and Deku, who were still sitting like statues as they continued their creepy staring contest. Katsuki scoffed and rolled his eyes. Would Kirishima ever let him hear the end of it if he just left? At least then he wouldn't have to deal with stupid Deku and his stupid face and the stupid detective and their stupid staring contest. He was leaving anyway, no matter what Kirishima said. Katsuki was just making to stand when the tension between Deku and the detective snapped like a rubber band and there wasn't even a split second of warning before Katsuki's entire world was flipped on its head. Deku was holding a knife to someone's throat. Katsuki hardly even heard the extras all around them screaming as they saw the weapon, and he was only vaguely aware of the way his classmates were falling into battle stances. In fact, he could hardly pay attention to anything besides the cruel smile spreading across Deku's face as his brain screamed that this couldn't possibly be happening. When had the innocent, weak, useless Deku he grew up with started acting like a villain? Tsukachi's gun glinted in the light and Katsuki wondered how he'd missed the detective pulling it out. He must have been preoccupied with Deku's knife. Drop the knife, Midoriya. We found the program and disabled it. We aren't going to let you get away again, so just give it up. A quick glance at his classmates revealed that they were just as confused as Katsuki was. What program? And again? What the F was he talking about? Deku was a nobody. Deku's smile got sharper and Uraraka hissed as a drop of blood started sliding down her throat. Are you really willing to let a budding future hero die, just to catch Mitsukachi? Aren't you supposed to be one of the good guys? Katsuki felt numb. Was he actually talking about killing Uraraka? Deku? Really? He would have been tempted to laugh at the sheer ridiculousness of it all if this whole thing didn't feel so much like a hostage situation. What gave Deku the right to threaten to kill one of his classmates like this? Who did that DMN nerd think he was? Katsuki was tempted to laugh anyway, just to piss Deku off, but then the detective's eyes hardened in determination. I'm afraid you don't quite understand your situation, Midoriya. He shifted his gun so that, if he pulled the trigger, the bullet would go straight through Deku's brain before anyone had the chance to blink. I am prepared to take the shot. And these are hero students who all have the necessary first aid training to keep Uraraka alive long enough to get her to a hospital. You are leaving here in HNDCFFS or a body bag, but those are your only options, so choose wisely. Did the detectives seriously just threaten to kill Deku? Kill orders were rare and were often only authorized on villains rank A and above, so even if Deku was a villain, which was impossible because he was useless, he still shouldn't merit an ultimatum like that. It didn't make any sense. The demon nerd couldn't hurt a fly even if he wanted to. He was FNG quirkless. Nothing more than a goddamn pebble on the side of Katsuki's road to greatness. What gave him the right to have cops treat him as a serious threat? He half expected Deku to keep giving that creepy smile and laugh, or maybe dissolve into nervous stutters like he had every time Katsuki had threatened him back in middle school and tried to frantically convince the detective that there must have been some mistake. Instead, Deku's smile slowly melted and it looks like he was actually taking the detective's threat seriously. Katsuki wanted to scream that the detective had to be bluffing. Deku wasn't a threat and he definitely wasn't an important enough villain to warrant a bullet to the head, so this all had to be some big joke designed to make Katsuki look like an idiot or something. Kirishima grabbed his arm, almost like he could tell what Katsuki was about to do, and pleaded silently for him to stay still. Katsuki understood, he really did. The tension in the room was so thick that it felt like one wrong move could get someone killed, but Katsuki knew that there was no way Deku was as dangerous as the detective was making him out to be. Even Katsuki would be a better villain than he was. Before Katsuki could say anything, however, Deku made his decision. The tension melted from the nerd's body as he sighed and dropped his knife, raising his hands up in surrender. Immediately, Uraraka ran into Ida's arms and the detective forced Deku to the ground, handcuffing him with probably a bit more force than was strictly necessary for a quirkless weakening like him. Katsuki waited for the detective to read the DMN nerd his rights. At least then, maybe he'd know what Deku was being arrested for and what necessitated a goddamn kill order that the nerd didn't deserve. To his surprise, Deku actually had a small smile on his face as the detective tightened the HNDCFFS, like he was proud of whatever lame crime had gotten him arrested or something. Izuku Midoriya. The detective growled. You are under arrest for crimes committed as the villain Mastermind. Katsuki shattered. Shudo was watching TV with Dabi and Toga when he got the text. Actually, it was 4 texts in a row, which wasn't that odd for Izuku considering how he liked to ramble, but what was odd were the typos and how cryptic and disconnected the texts were. From Izuku. I love you. Look in box under couch at base. M4 Sturm 1 ND404, use year fingerprint I'm sorry. Shudo tried to ignore the slow feeling of dread pooling in his stomach as he tried to riddle through whatever it was that Izuku was trying to say. He'd never mentioned a box like that before, much less asked Shudo to look in it. His first thought was that it must be some sort of gift or surprise for him, but he dismissed that possibility almost immediately. Izuku only locked or coded things that had to do with business, and on the weird off chance it was a present, why wasn't Izuku opening it with him? So it couldn't be that, which left, Shudo had no idea. And then there was the typos. With the exception of what he assumed to be the passcode, the rest of the messages were either probably autocorrected or had typos, which Izuku was usually careful and professional enough to avoid. It was almost like he'd been trying to text without looking at his phone. "You've been frowning at your phone for a full minute, Shudo." Toga piped up, making him jump. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Shudo said quickly. I think." Shudo hurriedly clicked on Izuku's contact and held the phone up to his ear. It wouldn't call him, right? Izuku would probably just laugh it off and tell him not to worry so much. Maybe he'd probably even offer to meet him in an hour to open that box if Shudo asked, just to humor him. Shudo stood up from the couch and started pacing as the phone rang too many times. Why wasn't Izuku picking up? It was the middle of the day, so he couldn't be in a meeting with a client. And hadn't he just texted Shudo this morning asking if he wanted anything at the mall? Hi. This is Izuku. I don't know why you'd want to leave a message here, but you can if you want. Bye. The pool of dread in his stomach flooded into a full-body nausea as Shudo desperately hung up and redialed. What if something was wrong? What if another villain had attacked him and he hadn't pulled out his knife fast enough? What if someone had tried threatening his mom again? Hi. This is Izuku. I don't. Shudo? Toga asked, far too quiet to be normal for her. I think you need to see this. She pointed to the television screen, which now had a breaking news border on the bottom. Shudo whipped around and froze as his brain finally registered what he was watching. The words Mastermind finally arrested scrolled across the bottom of the screen as detective. Tsukachi frog-marched Izuku through the crowd of reporters. Uraraka and some of his other former classmates were crowded around an ambulance in the background, shock blankets wrapped around a few of their shoulders as they stared after Izuku in shock and fear. Dozens of heroes and police held back the ever-growing crowd as they yelled and screamed questions and insults at the first person Shudo had ever found that gave a shit about him. Izuku's arms were cuffed heavily behind him, and he was smirking at the cameras even as the detective shoved him into the fortified back seat of a police car. His clothes were disheveled and Officer Sansa was carrying a bulging evidence bag as he followed the detective, so they had obviously stripped Izuku of all of his knives before escorting him out of the mall. How dare they? Shudo didn't even register that he was heading for the door until Dabi held him back. Don't be an idiot, Shudo. Do you see how many heroes there are? They're expecting us to try to save him, so you can't just storm in there with no plan and no backup. Midoriya wouldn't do that. Let me go. Shudo growled, letting flames engulf his arm to force Dabi to back off. I have to help him. Then at least be smart about it. Dabi yelled back. If you go in alone like this, you'll just get yourself caught and put the rest of the league at risk to boot. Then come with me. Shudo panted and a wild light entered his eyes as an idea occurred to him. We'll have Johnny's quirk warp us. Shigaraki. Toga and Dabi trailed behind him as Shudo raced at full speed to Shigaraki's room. Other doors opened curiously as the rest of the league peeked out to see what the commotion was about, joining the mob as Shudo slid down the hall of the hideout. He didn't even come to a full stop before bursting through Shigaraki's door, making it slam roughly against the wall, not that he cared much about that at the moment. Shigaraki? No. The silence was immediate. The only sound left was the chaotic drone of the news as it played quietly from Shigaraki's computer. He had a different video playing on each of his gaming screens, so at least Shudo didn't have to worry that he didn't know about Izuku's arrest, but that brought up an even worse question. Shudo's voice was laced with poison when he spoke again. Why not? Shigaraki growled and scratched at his neck. Look at all those heroes, Shudo. Do you really think we can take all of them? Even if we were to use Johnny's quirk, they'd still attack us before we could even find the car Mastermind is in. And if you think they don't have a racer on standby waiting for us to show up, then you're a complete and utter noob. And those cuffs they put him in? Sensei told me about them. They're quirk made to form a force field around a guy and prevent any quirks from affecting him, so we can't even use Johnny's warp to pull him out. Don't you think it was the first thing I tried? Get it through your thick head, you idiot. We're underleveled for this boss fight. So you're just abandoning him? Shudo screamed. He needed to leave. Even if the rest of the league wouldn't help him, he had to do something. He could freeze the cop car. Or burn it. But that would hurt Izuku. And even if he managed it, Aizawa would erase his quirk before he could even get to Izuku, and then where would he be? At some point Dabi had started holding him back again, probably to prevent him from bolting away like he'd been half planning to do. Shudo held on to his brother for dear life, ignoring the rest of the league as they watched on in awkwardness, pity, anger, and whatever other emotions people are supposed to feel when their friend is suddenly torn away from them. I love him. Shudo choked out. His quirk was going wild in a way that would have made his father go ballistic, a thought that only made him sob harder. The tears from his left eye evaporated into steam before they even reached his chin, while the tears on his right were rapidly forming a thin trail of unmeltable ice. Dabi didn't seem to judge him for his lack of control, though. In fact, the only reaction he gave to it was subtly shifting to Shudo's right side so he wouldn't get burned as he ran his fingers through Shudo's hair. I know. Show what I know. He had to have had some sort of a plan for this, right? Spinner asked quietly. I mean, it's Mastermind. He planned for everything. That would make sense. Magna glanced down the hall. The rest of the league followed her gaze. It had taken several hours for Shudo to finally exhaust himself and pass out in Dabi's arms, but who knew what he was going to do when he woke up? I mean, Mine-chan is one of my best friends. Toga bit at her lip, sharp teeth digging through the skin and making her bleed. But Shudo just lost his boyfriend, so it's even less cute. We need to save him. Obviously. Shigaraki griped. He's one of us, even if he doesn't want to be tied down to the league, he's helped us out enough that we owe him this one. And we're not the only ones. Half the underground is in Mastermind's debt one way or another. But what are we supposed to do? Hawk's wings fluttered anxiously. At one point he had stress gripped onto Dabi's arm and still hadn't been able to let go. You know they're not going to risk anything with such a high-profile villain. He's going to get sent straight to Tartarus even before a trial. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they held the trial at Tartarus, just out of paranoia that he'd try to escape. There's no way we can break into there. It's the most secure prison on Earth. Twice yelled quietly. Secure, skicure. We can break in minutes. Just let them try to stop us. There's no point in worrying about this now. Mr. Compress spoke up. I took the liberty of looking through Freezerburn's last texts with Mastermind, and it seems our ally has a plan, but we need to trust him. It appears that he designed whatever mechanism is defending his stage directions so that only Shudo will be able to unlock them. He glanced again toward Shudo's door, which was still closed tightly. All we can do is wait in the wings until our cue comes. Nedzu's ears twitched at the sheer volume of the gathered crowd, and they weren't even in the same room. The media had, predictably, been chomping at the bit since Mastermind's arrest that morning, but the police and Hero's primary focus had been clearing the mall and the Midoriya residence as well as safely and securely transporting the villain in question to Tartarus, so as of yet, no official statement had been made. Until now, the media had been content to gather their own information, but Nedzu wasn't stupid enough to believe that they would accept that forever, so he had, of course, requested the chief of police organize a press conference. At the very least, it would appease the media and give the people of Japan confidence that Mastermind really was gone. Plus, it would give them a chance to take control of the flow of information before the League of Villains or Mastermind's other allies had a chance to twist the narrative. Nedzu turned to Detective Tsukachi and Chief Tsuragami. Are you gentlemen ready? Ready for this to be over, Tsukachi said tersely. And maybe ready for a drink, Tsuragami replied. All in due time. Nedzu smiled and pushed open the door, the noise exploding in volume without any barrier in between. All in due time. The three of them ignored the reporters' shouted questions as they took their places at the table. Chief Tsuragame growled subtly before clearing his throat. "If everyone will please settle down, we are ready to begin." Nedzu waited for the crowd to reluctantly fall silent before chirping into his microphone. "Very well, let's get started." He had to hold up a warning hand when the crowd of reporters surged forward to ask their questions. "Please hold all questions until the end of our prepared statement." The crowd settled down again and Nedzu nodded to Tsukachi, who rustled with the papers in front of him for a moment before taking a deep breath and speaking into the microphone. "My name is Naomasa Tsukachi and I am one of the lead detectives on this case. At 11:38 this morning, police and heroes successfully apprehended the villain popularly known as Mastermind and safely transported him to Tartarus, where he is currently in secure custody. Investigators have discovered Mastermind's identity to be that of Izuku Midoriya. Age, quirk." Tsukachi took a deep breath and glanced at Nedzu. "Not applicable." The crowd erupted into mutters, but Tsukachi simply steamrolled on and they were forced to quiet down if they wanted to hear. "The murder plans that have been keeping the ongoing hostage situation in place have been confiscated as well as all known backups. The heroes in question have been informed and measures are currently being put in place to counteract said plans in case of unexpected villain attacks. We know that this has been a long and difficult time and there are still many repercussions from Mastermind's reign of terror that remain to be seen, but we are confident that things are going to improve now that he is behind bars. Thank you." There was nothing left to do to hold back the questions now, so Nedzu sighed and picked a reporter at random. "Yes? What is your question?" "You said Mastermind's quirk is, quote, not applicable. What does that mean exactly?" "It means that Izuku Midoriya, also known as Mastermind, is quirkless." Nedzu responded, flinching slightly at the outraged yells echoing around the room. It was days like these he wished for a human's less sensitive hearing. "Any other questions?" Another round of hands shot up and Nizu pointed to another reporter. "Are you sure you even have the right guy?" they asked. It seems ridiculous to think that a quirkless teenager has been the one terrorizing Japan for over a year. If you're not certain that the boy you arrested is Mastermind, then why be so hasty and potentially put good heroes at risk on a hunch? Tsuragame had a slight growl in his voice as he responded, but not enough to cause any offense to the reporter in question. "Despite his quirk situation, we are completely confident that Izuku Midoriya is Mastermind. Conclusive pieces of evidence, including the plans to kill the top 50 pro-heroes as well as other in-progress plans, were recovered from his computer and there were numerous weapons found both on his person and in his room. In addition, during his arrest, he threatened pro-heroes in training that were present on site and said other things that implied his identity. We would not have moved to arrest him if we were not completely certain we had the right suspect. That evidence could have been planted." Another reporter called out, "How do you know Midoriya isn't just a victim being paid, or worse threatened, to take the fall for a truly dangerous criminal? We had already suspected that Mastermind might be quirkless." Nedzu responded firmly. "We have known that was a possibility for quite some time, but chose to keep that knowledge confidential in order to not impede the investigation, so while it may come as a surprise to you, it does not come as one to those who have been investigating this dangerous villain and his crimes." "Even if you, by some miracle, do have the right guy," someone asked, "do you really think it a wise use of resources to send a quirkless child to Tartarus? That prison is designed to counteract dangerous quirks, is it not? It makes no sense for someone quirkless to be there. Tartarus is designed to handle dangerous villains that are difficult to control." Tsuragame responded, "With Mastermind's high body count and ability to manipulate most strategies to his benefit, I think you'll agree that he qualifies." The reporter seemed like he was about to ask a follow-up question, but Tsukachi quickly interrupted him. "We have said all we are going to say on the subject of Mastermind's quirk. If we receive any more information or make any new discoveries regarding it, we will release the information using the proper channels." Tsukachi said decisively. "Are there any other questions?" There was a moment of hesitation before a reporter in the front of the crowd raised her hand. "I assume that you are aware of the videos posted by bystanders who witnessed the arrest." What do you have to say in defense of the seemingly reckless plan carried out by Detective Tsukachi? When apprehending a villain like Mastermind who is obviously not afraid to take hostages, wouldn't it have been better to do so in a location without as many potential victims? In this case, speed was of the essence. Nedzu answered, "We knew that we had a very narrow window between disabling the program that would release Midoriya's murder plans and his discovery of our tampering, and we were also well aware that if we did not complete the arrest before or at least shortly after that discovery, Midoriya would have the means and motive to disappear into the shadows, making him that much more difficult to capture. I was assigned to tail him." Tsukachi continued the explanation where Nedzu had left off. Both the heroes and I working on this case knew that the location was not ideal for Mastermind's arrest, but unfortunately, I could not influence his movements before the moment that Nedzu succeeded in disabling the program, and I could not wait for him to leave before apprehending him, due to the danger of him getting away. Still, another reporter piped up, "In your eagerness to arrest Mastermind, you put numerous civilians in danger, including one who, if I saw correctly on the videos, ended up with a knife to her throat, and yet you still continued with the arrest despite that danger. Many more civilians would have been in danger if Midoriya were allowed to escape." Tsukachi spat. "Are you saying that their lives were worth the risk? How many innocent lives were you willing to sacrifice to catch one criminal? Does that girl know you were willing to let her die, just to catch a quirkless kid?" "Enough," Nedzu said loudly. He glared down the now silent reporters. "Do I need to remind you of how dangerous Mastermind can be?" And in response to your questions, heroes were waiting as backup to handle any dangers to the surrounding civilians. The young woman taken hostage is a hero in training herself. Her and her classmates are all well acquainted with the dangers inherent to villain apprehension and were authorized to use their quirks to fight if anything should go wrong. He conveniently did not mention that the students had not been aware of the situation at the time. If it had been any other group of teenagers at the mall that morning, it wouldn't be possible, but what with it being Class 1A, it should be fairly easy to spin the situation to seem like their presence had been part of the plan all along. In hindsight, they most likely should have been, but there was no use in crying over spilt milk. The reporters took the bait, nodding along as they decided that Uraraka had known the risks she was taking by being around a villain. Nedzu was already planning on apologizing to those poor students later, as well as offering counseling through the school should they desire it. It was unfair of him to put the situation in this light, but as future heroes, his students would understand that it was necessary to do so to keep heroes cast in a positive light in society's eyes, or at least as positive as possible. They couldn't afford to let more good people fall to villainy. A few more questions were asked, but thankfully they did not lose control of the crowd again. Tsugarami gave a short closing statement, and then they were walking off the stage and back through the door they came in. The noise of the crowd was significantly quieter now that the press conference had concluded. Tsukachi groaned and dragged a hand down his face. "It's bittersweet, isn't it? On the one hand, Mastermind is finally off the streets, but on the other, society's trust in heroes is hanging on by a thread, if not outright shattered." Tsugarami finished. Because how effective can heroes really be if a quirkless teenager was such a big threat? It still remains to be seen where the pieces will fall. Nedzu said calmly, "I consider it an interesting challenge." And he had never been one to step down from one of those. Nedzu moved his knight, removing Midoriya's queen from play. "Well, I must admit, I was expecting your strategy skills to translate to chess a tiny bit better." The wonders of technology meant that they each had a holographic chessboard in front of them, enabling them to play without ever actually coming into contact with one another, as per Tartarus regulations. It made the gameplay much smoother than if Midoriya had had to call out his moves for Nedzu to move the pieces. Sometimes, it's not about winning the game, Nedzu, but the war. Midoriya responded smoothly, moving his rook forward. "But maybe I'm just used to a bigger board." "Ah yes." Nedzu thought for a moment before moving one of his pieces. "You're quite used to having all of society as your plaything, aren't you? It must be quite a shame being confined to such a small space with such limited contact with the outside world." Maybe that's the difference between us." Midoriya smiled. "You're so limited. You seem to think that this room is my whole game board, since that's where I am right now, but you're forgetting that in chess, the king only ever inhabits one space. Nedzu only saw the trap a split second before Midoriya used one of his pawns to take out his king. He stared at the finished game passively, careful not to let any of his shock show on his face as he realized that Midoriya must have thrown the past few matches. With how confident he had been acting since his arrest, Nedzu had forgotten that Midoriya, above all else, was a master at being underestimated. It was just one part of why it had taken so long to catch him, after all. The board hasn't changed, Nedzu, and neither have the players. Midoriya stood up from his chair at the window and went back to his bed. Better luck next time. And you two are sure that the police don't know about Izuku's base? Shoto asked again. Positive, young chap. Gentle criminal's laugh echoed over the receiver. If they knew of it, they would have already descended upon it like flies. Mastermind was careful never to have all of his resources connected. La Brava added. As soon as I got the news he'd been arrested, I left some breadcrumbs for the authorities, just enough that they could reasonably believe they'd found everything, but his main base was connected to another account. The heroes shouldn't even be looking for it. Shoto nodded, not that they could see him over the phone. Thank you. I'll talk to you later if I find anything. Shoto, La Brava sounded hesitant. I'm sorry. I should have thought the hostage program was some of my best work, but once they were in the mainframe. Shoto was silent for a long moment before he responded, like I said, I'll talk to you later. He hung up and tossed the phone beside him on the bed, then groaned and put his head in his hands. He knew La Brava had done her best on that program. He knew it. And it had worked. That hostage situation had kept Izuku from getting arrested for almost a year. But at the end of the day, it had failed. Izuku had trusted La Brava, but she'd failed, and while Shoto would still work with her, he wasn't willing to forgive her yet. Maybe, depending on how things worked out these next few months, he would, but he wasn't holding his breath. Finally, after a long moment, he grabbed his phone again, stuffing it in his pocket along with his keys as he shoved a beanie on his head to cover his hair. Dabi and Shigaraki were sitting on the couch playing video games when he passed through the living room on his way out the door. Dabi put down his controller and gave him a long look. You going to his base? Shoto shrugged and Dabi looked torn. Just be careful. It's only been a week, so we really should be lying low right now. I have been lying low. Shoto growled. But if Izuku left me something, I have to know. Lay off the kid, Dabi. It's no time for your stupid sibling rivalry. Shigaraki took a hand off his own controller and started scratching at his neck. No one's arguing that you shouldn't go, we're all dying of curiosity too, or did you forget that Mastermind is our friend too? Are you sure you need to go alone? Dabi asked. It might be better to have backup. 2 people will be more conspicuous than 1. Shoto argued. I know you're worried about me, but with the way all of our faces are on the news right now, it's safer if only one of us goes, and Izuku said I'd be the only one able to open the box. I have my phone, I'll call if I get in any trouble. Dabi looked hesitant, but eventually nodded and picked up his controller again. Don't die. Shoto scoffed. No promises. Just get out of here before I kill you myself. Shigaraki griped. Shoto smiled despite everything and made his way out of the League hideout and out onto the street. He made sure to match the body language of the other people on the street as he hurried to his destination, head down and trying not to call too much attention to himself. The mood on the streets had shifted significantly from what it had been during the Age of Heroes, but it had taken a significant hit since the Hero Commission had fallen. It had a lot to do with the increase in villainy, but people didn't just walk around without fear anymore, expecting a hero to save them from anything that could possibly go wrong. It would have been almost sad if their previous confidence hadn't been built on lies and propaganda. Thankfully, no one gave Shoto a second glance as he hurried to Izuku's base. He glanced around briefly to make sure there really weren't any heroes around before he used his key to let himself in. He had to take a deep breath to stop himself from crying as he crossed the threshold. It was like walking back in time. Even though everything had changed in the outside world, apparently no one had had a chance to tell that to the apartment. Nothing had moved an inch since the last time he had been here. There were still papers on the coffee table from Izuku taking notes while watching the news. There were still dishes on the rack that had been left to dry. There was even still a half-full can of flat soda on the counter. It was jarring. Shudo took another deep breath and crouched down to look underneath the couch. The box was wedged all the way back against the wall, and Shudo knew he probably looked extremely undignified as he stretched to reach it and slide it out. There was a rasping sound as it slid across the floor, and it was heavier than Shudo had expected when he picked it up and sat down on the couch. It looked surprisingly normal. Just a standard-looking tackle box, if you didn't pay attention to the fact that it was made of thick metal and had a high-tech-looking lock where the latch should be. He blew away the thin layer of dust on top and entered the passcode that Izuku had texted him. The box beeped at him and a small screen that Shudo hadn't even seen lit up. A small light was blinking orange and Shudo leaned closer to read the prompt that had appeared. Fingerprint required. There wasn't a fingerprint scanner that he could see, so Shudo settled for pressing his thumb against the screen, holding his breath and hoping against hope that it would actually work. The machine seemed to think for half a second before there was another loud beep and the light turned a solid green. But, Bonafide, Shudo. There was a click as the box unlocked and Shudo almost ripped the box open as soon as he heard it. Inside were a few notebooks and flash drives, but what caught Shudo's attention was the envelope on top with his name on it in Izuku's handwriting. His hands trembled as he carefully tore it open and took out the letter inside. Dear Shudo, if you're reading this letter, I'm sorry. I've probably been arrested, haven't I? It's going to happen eventually, I know. You can't become as big of a villain as I have without making a few enemies in law enforcement. I'm sorry for leaving you behind, especially if you weren't given any warning. I hope that I at least got a chance to say goodbye. Shudo rubbed his eyes and took a shaky breath. He didn't think that a handful of frantic texts counted as goodbye. So, what happens now? I'm just a quirkless kid, so there's a chance that the heroes won't be able to see past their own biases and send me to a normal prison, in which case the yellow notebook should be your best bet. If they sent me to Tartarus, it'll be a little more difficult and definitely a lot more risky, but doable. Wherever I am, they're probably limiting my contact with the outside world, so unfortunately, most of the work is going to be left to you, the League, and whoever else wants to get on my good side. The black notebook should have enough dirt on local villains that you can blackmail them into helping you if you need to, but I don't think you'll need to use that one too much, unless, of course, they sent me to Tartarus. The secret about Tartarus is that they see the people on the inside as the biggest threat, which would normally be true. The people locked inside are among the most dangerous on Earth, but the heroes have lived too long in the age of the symbol of peace. They're used to villains being too afraid to band together, and that is their weakness. Tell Shigaraki I'm sorry. He never asked about getting into Tartarus, and I was certain that Sensei had his own plans that I didn't want to interfere with, especially with how difficult and dangerous this will be. No one has ever escaped Tartarus before, but then again, there's never been a quirkless #1 villain before either. Be sure to read the red notebooks carefully. I've included several backup plans in case things go wrong, but I have faith in you, Shudo. I know you can save me. See you soon. Izuku Midoriya. Mastermind chapter text. Shoyuta was tired. He'd been saying that for years, of course, but he almost wished that he could go back and hit the him of 2 years ago over the head and knock some gratitude in his stupid, tired head. He hadn't even realized how well-rested he used to be before everything came crashing down, and he found himself with more responsibility than he'd ever asked for in his career. It had started with Eri, of course. When she had first ended up in police custody, they hadn't been sure what her quirk was, and she obviously hadn't liked talking about it, but after a few sessions with a counselor, she'd finally opened up about Rewind and revealed how lethal it could potentially be, especially since she had practically zero training to control it. It was already a given that she would be put under hero protection. Even if Overhaul's gang had been wiped out, there were plenty of other villains that would jump at the chance to use her the same way he had, and a normal civilian foster family just wouldn't be equipped to deal with it. After they had figured out the specifics of her quirk, however, it was only logical to place her with Shoyuta, who could easily turn off her quirk if it went out of control and who had experience with both teaching and quirk discrimination. He hadn't been planning on adopting her, but well, he was one of the only people she was willing to trust, so it was only logical to make it official. The fact that he could turn off her quirk had done a lot to gain her trust. Overhaul had raised her to believe that her quirk was evil or a disease, and it was going to take a lot time for her to heal from that indoctrination, but it meant that Eri wasn't as afraid of hurting him because he could protect himself from her. He hadn't been planning on basically becoming a de facto father to a traumatized little girl, but after months of soothing nightmares and teaching her to control her quirk, he'd had to admit that he couldn't imagine his life without her. But having a kid around constantly did make him more tired than he had been when the only things he had to keep alive were his cats. The next big thing that was adding to his exhaustion were the increased crime rates. Mastermind's reign of terror had emboldened the local criminals and encouraged them to work smarter. Add to that the League of Villains influence that had started a trend toward larger villain groups and teamwork, and it equaled a lot more work for the heroes that still hadn't been killed or pushed into retirement. And then, of course, the Hero Commission had fallen and they'd had to redesign the entire hero course. For as long as UA had existed, there had always been a push toward creating heroes who would be popular and do well in the media spotlight. It was something that the Commission had encouraged and was a large part of the reason that UA had gained the title of Top Hero School, but now, it was actually a distinct disadvantage. According to the applications for next year, the few kids who were still aiming to be heroes were overwhelmingly choosing other schools to go to precisely because UA created such popular heroes. No one wanted to go to a program that would paint a target on their backs for Mastermind or any other villain with a similar agenda, so if UA was going to survive in this new world, they were going to have to adapt. A lot. And who did Nedzu turn to as the expert in underground heroics? The underground hero, Eraserhead. He was a master of staying out of the media and operating in the shadows, so the only reasonable course of action was to put him in charge of spearheading the new heroics program. On the one hand, it was a wonderful opportunity to finally fix things that Shoyuta had hated since he'd been a student. He'd gotten rid of the sports festival, for one, so that they wouldn't be broadcasting students' quirks to their enemies, and he'd actually gotten approval to change the entrance exam to something that actually measured students' dedication and quirk control, rather than simply screening for flashy and destructive quirks, so he was grateful for those wins. On the other hand, however, he was having to create almost an entirely different curriculum to include underground essentials like parkour, information gathering, and stealth, which was a lot of work. Media manipulation classes had changed from how to keep the public's attention and get a good reputation to how to avoid reporters and how to spread misinformation so that any articles written wouldn't equal a death sentence. The other teachers and most of the students were completely lost as they tried to navigate a career that was now fundamentally different than what they had signed up for. And they were all looking to him to guide them through it. Shoyuta sighed as he finished washing his face and looked at his face in the mirror. Was it normal to start going gray at 30? Probably not, but then again, Shoyuta really hadn't ever cared about his hair before, so he wasn't about to start now. He grabbed an elastic from beside the sink and pulled his hair into a half-hearted bun as he left the bathroom to go get started on breakfast. Eri was already awake, which wasn't a surprise. Insomnia was a common enough PTSD symptom, and Shoyuta had been very careful to let Eri know that it was okay and she was allowed to do things like draw or watch TV when she couldn't sleep. Instead of a cartoon, though, this morning she was watching the news, a forgotten drawing and crayons sitting on the table in front of her. Currently awaiting trial in Tartarus. The reporter said, the green screen behind him flashing to pictures of Midoriya's arrest. It seemed like the vultures weren't talking about anything else lately. It was Mastermind this and Midoriya that and his personal favorite. Could someone quirkless really do all this? It was ridiculous. That was what they got for consistently emphasizing powerful quirks, though. Someone's quirk didn't equate to their potential and definitely didn't equate to their danger level, if Midoriya's rise to power had proved anything, but people's prejudices blinded them to that fact. Shoyuta ran a hand through Eri's hair. If anyone else had tried to touch her, she would have frozen and panicked, but with Shoyuta she leaned into the touch. Hey kid. He sat down heavily beside her on the couch. How are you this morning? Eri frowned and looked at the screen, where the reporters were still droning on about the same overplayed facts they'd dug up. About Mastermind's rise of power, is Mastermind-sama going to be okay? Shoyuta sighed. Eri had been having a hard time with Midoriya's arrest, obviously. He'd saved her from her abuser, even if he hadn't originally meant to, so it was obviously confusing to her that he was being treated as a villain when she saw him as her hero. He'll be fine, Shoyuta said for about the 100th time. Prison is the safest place for him to be, both for him right now and for everyone else. Eri nodded. This wasn't the first time that they'd had this conversation, and Shoyuta knew it wouldn't be the last. It would be simpler if Shoyuta could divide the world into black and white for her, tell her that there were some people that were good and some that were evil and that there were hard lines in between them, but society no longer had the luxury of ignoring the gray. Midoriya had made sure of that. They're saying such mean things about him though, Eri pouted. What if he hears them? He doesn't have access to the news where he is. Shoyuta explained patiently, leaving out the fact that Midoriya was smart enough to figure out exactly what the media were saying about him. He's not going to hear them. But they're so mean. Eri whined. He's nice. They're lying. Shoyuta put a hand on her shoulder and looked into her eyes. Mastermind hurt a lot of people, Eri, and he made a lot of people angry because sometimes he hurt bad people like Overhaul, but sometimes he hurt good people like All Might. People are going to be angry with him for that, and that's okay. I know, Eri picked at one of her fingernails. But I wish they could see how nice he is. He saved me. How about we turn this off? Shoyuta suggested. I can turn on the princess movie you like, the one about the girl escaping her tower? Eri's eyes widened. The one with the healing quirk that was saved by a villain too? Shuta's shoulders slumped slightly and he grumbled. I guess Flynn Rider was kind of a villain, wasn't he? No wonder you like that movie so much. Well, how about it? You want to watch Tangled? Eri almost smiled as she nodded. Almost. Inko hadn't been able to leave her house since Izuku was arrested, both because of the protesters that were camped outside and because most days, she could hardly find the strength to leave her bed most days. She felt so betrayed, both by the heroes and her own son. Learning that her son was a wanted villain had been enough of a shock, but realizing that the police had used her ignorance against her just to catch him? Saying that had broken her sounded so dramatic, but there was really no other way to describe it. Of course, Netsu had patiently explained why that had been their only available course of action, and Inko would have been able to understand the logic of it if it wasn't her son. How would things have worked out differently if she had realized the true implications of the notebook she'd found before taking it to the police? The thought had been popping up at random moments for the past few weeks like an itch that wouldn't go away no matter how hard she scratched. Would she have turned him in of her own free will? Would she have kept his secret? Would she have kicked him out? If she had begged him to stop, would he have listened? Her answers seemed to change by the day until they were so muddled together that she just wanted to pull her hair out, and the constant yells from the crowd outside didn't help. She had to turn on the radio 24/7 just to drown them out. They were calling her a bad mother, and as much as she tried to deny it, Inko had to admit that it was the truth. If she had just been a better mother, maybe she would have realized how bad things were for Izuku and could have stopped the bullying before he was pushed off the edge. Maybe if she'd realized how intelligent her son was, she could have encouraged him to become a doctor or even a quirk analyst that helped heroes, rather than hurt them. If she was a better mother, the hundreds of people that Izuku had killed would still be alive. She wanted to apologize and make things right, but it just felt so cheap. After all, her apologizing was part of what had started this whole mess, wasn't it? If she had just told Izuku he could be a hero when he'd asked instead of apologizing and shattering his dreams. She flinched as she heard an egg shatter against her window. The police protection they had placed were usually able to keep back the more violent protester and prevent them from reaching the house, but she knew that most of the officers hated her as well, just because of who her son was. She turned the music up slightly and tried to ignore her own thoughts. She missed her baby. The world had truly descended into chaos, hadn't it? Fumikage wrapped himself deeper in his cloak and observed the fake city. It was true that he was handling the transition easier than most of his classmates, but it was a small comfort when one considered the state of the world. The spotlight had never been a comfortable place for him, even before it became a dangerous place for any hero to reside. Perhaps it was because of his bond with Dark Shadow, but he had always felt more comfortable when embraced by shadows. He had always thought that made him different and strange, But it turned out that the light and sparkle he'd grown up seeing in the heroes on the news was simply a distraction to hide the revolting darkness seething just under the surface of society. It was as if, instead of the world full of brightness and hope that he'd been raised to believe in, hero society was simply a putrid oil spill that someone had dumped a thin layer of glitter on top of. When the light hit it, all anyone could see was the bright sparkle of fake plastic, ignorant to the damaging pollution that was lurking just underneath. Mastermind's reign of terror was terrible, but Fumikage couldn't decide if it was good or bad that he had unintentionally destroyed the spotlights that had reflected that false glitter of hope that the hero industry created. On the one hand, the world seemed like a darker place now than it ever had before, but on the other, those same shadows had finally unmasked the dark mess underneath, and it was only when those problems were visible that steps could be taken to fix them. As lost as Fumikage felt right now, he couldn't help but feel a sick sense of gratitude for the chance that they had been given to clean up their world and recover from this disaster. Not that he had ever spoken those thoughts to anyone outside of Dark Shadow, of course, not even the therapist that Aizawa had been making him go to ever since the summer camp disaster. He had given the justification that it was normal to experience trauma after a villain attack, but Fumikage knew the whole charade was to keep him from breaking down and giving into Dark Shadow's darker impulses. After all, at the end of the night, it hadn't been the villains that put Shoji in critical condition, it had been him. He couldn't just put glitter on that memory and ignore it like heroes did with everything else. Dark Shadow nudged his head slightly and Fumikage forced himself to come back to the present. There was no point in despairing over problems that he couldn't fix. He was just one student and he didn't have the power to clean up the messes his predecessors created. All he could do was be a good hero and try not to create more messes in the future, and for that he needed training. The current exercise was a stealth practice similar to Capture the Flag. Aizawa had set the class loose in the training grounds with the goal of being the last one standing, and it was every man for himself as they sought to simultaneously find the others while at the same time prevent themselves from being found. By Fumikage's count, about half of his classmates had already been found and had their bandanas stolen, leaving most of the more stealth-minded classmates as well as a few who had decided to ignore the point of the exercise entirely in favor of using head-on combat to steal bandanas. As if to prove his point, Bakugo went barreling down the street beneath him, using his explosions to propel himself and broadcasting his position to anyone still standing who was paying even the tiniest bit of attention. Fumikage sunk deeper into the shadows of his rooftop, Dark Shadow wrapping himself around him so that they were practically invisible as Bakugo started attacking Jiro, who had been unfortunate enough to capture his attention. Bakugo had always been unhinged, at least to a certain degree. No one who was completely sane yelled die before every attack, but he had been getting progressively worse ever since Mastermind's arrest. The change wasn't so much a result of Mastermind being arrested, however, as it was that Bakugo was showing his true colors in the absence of the grounding effect that the formerly self-deemed Baku Squad had been providing. Since the beginning of the year, many of the records from Bakugo's old middle school had been destroyed in a freak accident shortly after Mastermind's arrest. So of course no one knew for certain if Bakugo had had a hand in turning Mastermind to villainy, but with his general attitude and the obvious dislike he'd shown for Midoriya even before he revealed himself, it wasn't hard to put two and two together. The rumors had spread quickly after that. Some versions of the story cast Bakugo as the true villain, relentlessly bullying a defenseless quirkless kid until he broke, while others gave him a smaller role, but all of the rumors agreed that there was no way he was innocent. Even if Bakugo refused to confirm the rumors, they were still enough to make him something of a pariah within the halls of UA. For most students, the change was negligible. They had avoided Bakugo before, and simply continued avoiding him now that the new information had come out. The Baku Squad, however, was made up of kids that all had at least limited experience being on the wrong end of a bully-victim relationship. The worst had been Kirishima. Fumikage hadn't been there when the fight happened, but Koda had heard from a few courageous squirrels that Cementos had had to rebuild at least 3 walls afterwards. Both had been put on house arrest by Aizawa, but as far as anyone else in the class knew, neither had spoken a word to each other since. It would have been tragic if Fumikage wasn't sure it was justified. Fumikage wasn't even sure why they had allowed Bakugo to stay in the hero course, but he assumed that they were trying to prevent even more heroes and hero students from switching sides. Todoroki's switching had been bad enough, but Hawks had caused people to panic. Fumikage had just been about to finally stop going to his mandatory therapy appointments, but when Hawks joined the league, Aizawa extended his visits to help deal with the betrayal, just because Fumikage had interned with him. It was intended as a kindness and probably damage control just in case Hawks had decided to fill his head with dangerous ideas, but to Fumikage and Dark Shadow, it just felt like they were being punished for something they hadn't even known was happening. It had just been one more oil spill covered by glitter and sunlight. There. Dark Shadow whispered. Fumikage turned his attention to where his quirk was pointing and noted that one of the walls that almost seemed to be rippling. Tsu's camouflage was getting better. He could applaud her for that, but there were still a few tells that gave away her position. For his part, he forced himself to relax and pretend that they hadn't noticed her as she slowly approached them. Fumikage kept looking forward as she looped behind them, trusting his quirk to keep an eye on the blind spot until their opponent made her move. Now! At Dark Shadow's cue, Fumikage whipped around and grabbed Tsu's bandana as his quirk held her back by the wrists. "Thank you, Tsu, but your darkness is not yet sufficient to face ours." Tsu slumped in defeat as they let go of her, and she got the cue to return to the teachers now that she was out of the game. "Good luck, Ribbit." Fumikage nodded respectfully and watched her leave, then called Dark Shadow back around him and started looking out for any more movement. In the absence of light, their only option was to grow comfortable with shadows. Tamura didn't enjoy being patient. If there was a boss to fight, he would much rather fight it than waste time on meaningless side quests, but unfortunately, experience had taught him that grinding was necessary more often than not so the player didn't lose lives walking into a fight they weren't prepared for. It was why he hadn't gone to rescue All for One or Kurogyri immediately after the heroes had gotten to them. His party still needed to level up. They had more XP and had added powerful members to their party since then, but to raid the dungeon they had in mind, they still needed more. Thankfully, Mastermind had left behind a game plan. Shudo had come back to base with a set of notebooks that read like quest instructions, and they had been passed around and read so many times now that Spinner was starting to complain that they'd all memorized them. Tamura's hands itched to crumble Tartarus and everything it stood for into dust and speed through all the steps Mastermind had laid out until they reached their goal and reunited with their party, but he had to be patient. They needed materials, they needed the right party members, they needed to be in control. It was only a matter of time. They couldn't just rush into this quest, but Tamura hoped that the preparation would make the payoff that much more satisfying. I don't think anyone has any doubt that Japan has changed due to Mastermind's reign of terror. The station had brought in a different reporter for the day to play devil's advocate. Her name was apparently Hina Yu, according to the label that came up at the bottom of the screen every couple of minutes. You don't have to look farther than the most recent statistics for villain activity, which undeniably show that crime rates have been steadily increasing since Mastermind began systematically killing off heroes. But remember that correlation does not prove causation. The station's main reporter, Daikaku Miyagi, countered. Crime rates rise and fall just like the stock market, so there is a possibility that this is simply a natural uptick, not the result of Mastermind's influence. While that is theoretically true, you admitted, nobody, including yourself Miyagi, would have even considered that before Mastermind was revealed to be quirkless. There are many citizens, myself included, who are beginning to wonder if the people in charge are contorting a little too far to try to excuse the influence of someone who was supposed to be powerless. What people? Miyagi argued. The commission is gone and lawmakers only have so much power to enact change, none of which is going to be visible within the next few weeks. And whose fault is that? You pointed out. If it wasn't for the Cursed Throne, a direct result of Mastermind's actions, the Commission would still be in charge and covering up their corruption. Admit it, it's Mastermind's fault that lawmakers are scrambling right now. Giving it a nickname like the Cursed Throne gives it a little too much power. Miyagi tried. The fall of 3 number 1 heroes in a row was tragic, yes, but can it really be called a phenomenon if all 3 were unrelated? All Might's death was unexpected, and I'll admit that Mastermind might have twisted the knife, but he wouldn't have been able to gain access to UA without help. Endeavor's downfall was more the result of his own abuse than anything else, and Hawk's betrayal was because of the Commission, not Mastermind. Even the fall of the Commission itself was due to the League of Villains, so can we really say that it's Mastermind's fault that society is where it is? The League and Mastermind have always been on good terms, so you can't completely distinguish where one's influence ends and the other begins. You said. So yes, the League has definitely made their mark on Japan, but so has the symbol of freedom. Miyagi groaned audibly, not that nickname again. Inko knew she shouldn't be watching this. It was just one more way of torturing herself and reminding herself of all of her failures as a mother now that the hate groups and protesters had finally stopped gathering outside her building. She deserved what they were saying about her, though. That was her son they were talking about and debating. If she'd just been a better mother or encouraged him more? The urge to apologize was so strong that some days, she couldn't even think of anything else. She didn't know what she wanted to apologize for, exactly, just that she needed to do it like she needed air. Maybe she was trying to apologize for being a bad mother and letting her son become a villain? Or maybe she wanted to apologize for letting him get caught or for not doing enough to catch him. More than anything else, she wanted to apologize to his victims' families and help them gain some small measure of closure at the very least. She knew that if she were to go before a bunch of reporters or even do an interview, it would just sound cheap and manipulative, especially because her son was a master manipulator, but well, Inko felt like someone had to do it, and since Izuku obviously wasn't going to, then she'd just have to do it for him. She gathered the plate of cookies she'd made before finally grabbing the remote and turning off the news. They probably wouldn't accept them, but well, it was the thought that counted. Mitsuki knew she should call Inko, but what was she supposed to say? Hey Inko, sorry my brat bullied your kid for years and indirectly pushed him into killing hundreds of people. Wanna share casserole recipes? Yeah, 'cause that'd go over real well. Katsuki. Honestly, Mitsuki didn't know what to do with him. He'd been withdrawing into himself ever since Izuku had gotten arrested, which, as sick as it sounded, was almost a relief. He spent most of his time in his room, but then at least Mitsuki didn't have to wonder what to say to him or deal with the oppressive atmosphere of disappointment that almost suffocated her every time Masaru and Katsuki were in a room together. She could relate, obviously, since they hadn't raised their son to be a bully, but Masaru wasn't even trying to hide it. He'd always shown displeasure in quiet ways, which was somehow even more effective than Mitsuki's own yelling. So even though he hadn't said a word to Katsuki since everything went down, it was still painfully obvious how he felt about what their son had done. She flinched when she heard the door to Katsuki's room slam, and seconds later, he was stomping down the stairs, glaring at the world like it had personally offended him instead of the other way around. Mitsuki took a deep breath and tried to ignore the awkwardness as he came into the kitchen. Hey brat, what do you want for breakfast? I can make us something before you head to school. Quit trying to be nice, old hag. Katsuki growled. I know you hate me just as much as the old man does, but at least he doesn't try to hide it. Mitsuki melted. Katsuki, I'm just gonna get some toast, then I'll be out of your stupid hair. Katsuki grumbled, violently shoving bread into the toaster. It was a long few minutes of silence until it popped up and Katsuki practically ran out the door, not even saying goodbye before slamming the door behind him. Mitsuki wanted to drag him back to the house and beat it into his head that they didn't hate him and that they were still his parents and still loved him. But was she really sure? Magna waited until Shigaraki had reached a save point before standing in front of the TV. Hey Shiggy, can I talk to you about something? Shigaraki glared at her for a long moment before sighing and setting his controller on the coffee table. Shoot. Magna took a deep breath and tried to ignore the way that the other members of the league were obviously eavesdropping while trying to pretend that they weren't. She didn't think they'd judge her decision, but well, it was natural to be insecure sometimes, especially about big things like this where she needed their support. There's been a lot of changes lately. Magna started. Shigaraki nodded. Yeah, it's all those NPCs on the news seem to talk about. Is that a bad thing? Of course not. Magna shook her head. But I've been thinking about the kids. Hey, we're not just kids. Shudo shouted from across the room, giving away the fact that yes, everyone was listening. Just because we're a few years younger doesn't mean that we're any less capable. Dabi shoved a hand over his brother's mouth and nodded for Magna to continue. Sorry about my kid brother. Shut up, Shudo, the adults are talking. Did you seriously just lick me? Shudo stuck his tongue out as Dabi frantically wiped his hand off on Hawk's jacket, who wrinkled his nose in disgust as he tried to hold it out of reach. Boys? Stop fighting and let Big Sis Magna talk. What the bird said. Shigaraki griped. So, I wasn't talking about Shudo. Magna said. He's got Dabi looking out for him. I'm more concerned about all the kids who are growing up and don't know who to turn to. A lot of them were always taught that the heroes were always right because they were heroes. We obviously know that's not true, but for a lot of them, this is the first time that they're having to confront that fact. They're torn between the picture-perfect society they were taught about and the ugly truth we've dug up, and a lot of these kids don't know where they fall. There was silence for a long moment as they all processed that. Magna knew they understood. It was those same ugly truths that had led them to joining the League of Villains, after all. Each of them had had to confront the fact that society had lied and didn't have a place for them. It was why they were carving out that place for themselves now, no matter what it took. Shigaraki steepled his hands in front of him as he stared at her thoughtfully. What do you suggest? I know we all wished we'd had some kind of support when we were younger. Magna said. I want to give them that. I'd like to start some sort of like a support group almost where kids could get together and we won't hide things from them. We'll tell them the truth of the world the way it is and let them decide what to do about it. I want to be a big sis to them, just like I am to the League, and help them, you know? Let them know that they're not alone. It almost sounds like you're planning on recruiting the next generation. Compress pointed out. Indoctrinating the youth. Magna shrugged. We're not gonna force anyone to join. But if a kid decides on their own that society needs to change and knows who they want to be, are we really going to turn them away? She held her breath and could tell that the rest of the League were doing the same thing as they waited for Shigaraki to finish thinking. Finally, he sighed and picked up his controller, already unpausing his game. You can use one of the warehouses to give tutorials to the newbies. Just remember that the enemies see us as boss fights, not mentor characters, so this'll have to be a stealth mission. Don't get caught. As expected, the guards outside the facility had made her throw away the cookies before they'd let her inside, so Inko was empty-handed as she made her way to the room number that the receptionist had told her. She didn't think she'd ever get used to the way that complete strangers glared at her or the suspicion in their eyes, but at least people like the receptionist and the people on the train were giving her practice. She desperately wanted to hide, but Inko forced herself to hold her head high and keep going until she'd found the room she was looking for. She hesitated. Did she really have the right to be here? How would another mother take her apology, especially when her son clearly didn't regret what he'd done? Maybe she should just turn around and go home. She shook her head and forced herself to knock despite her anxiety. The urge to apologize might just be a manifestation of her guilt, but it wasn't going to go away if she did nothing. Even so, Inko half hoped that there wouldn't be any answer and was disappointed when a soft voice called out from inside. Come in. Inko took another deep breath and pushed the door open, her eyes immediately falling on the woman sitting on the bed and staring out the window, only looking up when Inko started talking. Rei Todoroki? My name is Inko Midoriya. I know it's far too little too late, but I'd like to apologize for what my son did to your boy Shudo. Inko tensely waited at the door for Rei's judgment. She didn't know what exactly she was expecting, perhaps something like yelling or screaming or getting her kicked out of the hospital, but it definitely wasn't a small, kind smile and Rei patting the bed to invite Inko to sit next to her. Inko frowned in confusion and softly closed the door behind her before crossing the room. She looked at Rei one last time for confirmation before stiffly sitting down after getting a kind nod. Rei kept up that small smile as she turned to look out the window again. It's strange as mothers, isn't it? We're always blaming ourselves for things that aren't our fault. It's nice to finally meet you, Inko Midoriya. You're the woman that raised Mastermind. Inko winced, her guilt hitting her with almost enough force to make herself jump up and run away, but she forced herself to stay. Even though this was deeply uncomfortable, It still needed to be done, and running away now wasn't going to do anything except give one more example of how she was a bad mother and a coward. I need to apologize for Izuku. Inko's voice broke, and she knew she would probably be crying if she hadn't already cried herself dry over the past week. Your Shudo was on track to become a hero, but then that baby, it wasn't fair of him to corrupt your son and lead him toward the darkness like that. My son was a bad influence, and I'm sorry. Apparently she wasn't as out of tears as she had thought, because she almost jumped as Rei gently used her thumb to wipe away the tears that had started streaming down her cheeks at some point during her apology. She didn't want to look, knowing that Rei would probably be looking at her in hate and anger for what her son had done and encouraged her own son to do as well. After everything, Rei would be completely justified in hating her, but even still, Inko couldn't help glancing up in some sick sense of self-destructive curiosity. She was almost startled to realize that, with all the emotions playing across Rei's face, hatred wasn't one of them. She didn't even look angry. Instead, there were tears in her own eyes as she smiled sadly. You don't have anything to apologize for. If anyone bears the guilt for what my sons became, it would be me and my husband. We failed them, and they were already broken by the time your son found them. If anything, I should be thanking you. What? Inko pulled away quickly. I raised a monster. You should hate me, not thank me. My Shudo was broken. Rei reminded her gently. Your son came along and picked up the pieces. He reunited Shudo with his brother and gave him not only a place to belong, but a family, as far as I can tell. As much as I hate to admit it, this might be the first time in Shudo's life that he is actually surrounded by a family that loves him and cares about him for him, rather than his quirk or what he can do. Rei sighed and went back to staring out the window. I made a lot of mistakes raising those boys. Well, raising all my children, but those two in particular. That I may not have chosen to marry him, but I didn't fight it either. I didn't stop him from casting Tuya aside or pushing Shudo too hard. I failed them both. Oh, Inko didn't quite know what to say. Rei was having to confront her failures as a parent just like Inko was, and they were both dealing with the same guilt and anxiety as they wondered what they could have changed or done better to keep their sons from becoming murderers. Rei took a deep breath and set her shoulders in determination. But that's why I need to thank you. You raised Izuku to care about other people, and he chose to care for my son. Izuku was there for Shudo when no one else was, not even me, and he gave my son a goal and a purpose beyond what my husband created him for, and that's why I'm so grateful for everything you and your son have done for my family. But, Inko stared at her in disbelief, but my son is a villain. You've seen the news. Izuku kills people. He made Shudo kill people. Rei shook her head. Whatever my son has done, it was his choice. I highly doubt Izuku would have been able to force him to do anything he didn't want to do. My son's actions are his own, and while I might wish that those boys didn't have to kill people to be happy, I'm not going to pretend like I don't understand why they chose that path. If anything, I'm proud of them for taking back control of their own lives. Rei laughed as Inko stared at her in horror. I know how that makes me sound. Believe me, I sound exactly like I deserve to be here in the loony bin, and you know what? Maybe I do. But I've already failed my sons enough already. I'm not going to keep making those mistakes by not supporting them and encouraging them to go after what makes them happy. Inko stood. Maybe I should leave. Rei nodded and went back to staring out the window again. I understand. I know you don't want to accept my gratitude, and it's easier to just believe that I'm insane, but still thank you. Inko only nodded before gathering up her bag and all but rushing from the room. She didn't talk to anyone else as she left the hospital as quickly as she could, ignoring the hateful glares from the staff as she passed. Once she was out on the street, Inko breathed a small sigh of relief. Rei wasn't in her right mind, of course. There was no other way that she would be grateful that her son became a murderer, so Inko didn't need to give the conversation a second thought. That knowledge didn't stop her from thinking about it the entire trip home. Katsuki threw his blankets to the floor in frustration. He couldn't sleep and everything SCD. Normally, when he was angry or something was not bothering him, Katsuki didn't get bothered like some stupid extra, But still, whenever things got to be too much, he usually just sparred with shitty hair until he felt in control again, but that wasn't an option anymore. Kirishima wasn't speaking to him, and neither were the other extras that usually hung around him like an annoying swarm of gnats or something. Katsuki didn't miss them, he didn't, but it was sure a hell of a lot quieter without them. He couldn't ask someone else in the class to spar with him either, because they all hated him too, but at least they had started hating him before the whole thing with Deku. And that was the problem, wasn't it? What Katsuki really wanted was to take out all this stupid restlessness on the idiot that had caused it, but Deku had gotten himself locked up in Tartarus and Katsuki couldn't beat him up like he deserved. He needed to beat something up, though. Badly. He would have just gone to the gym and destroyed a punching bag or two, but he'd tried that every night this week and it still hadn't calmed him down enough to be able to sleep. If only he had paid more attention to what Deku was becoming, maybe Katsuki wouldn't have missed his chance to take him down and prove that he was better than that stupid nerd. He would have beaten the crap out of him and those stupid extras that followed in his footsteps. Katsuki froze. That was an idea. He might not be able to take his rage out on the Deku that deserved it, but there were plenty of idiots on the streets that were inspired by the nerd, and now that he didn't need a license to use his quirk, there was nothing stopping him from beating them to a pulp. It might not be what he needed, but it was the next best thing. He grinned savagely as he grabbed his shoes and a plain black hoodie and got dressed before heading out the door. Sure, it was a little more complicated with the dorm system and would definitely be easier on the weekends when he visited his old hag, but Netsu and Aizawa were way too busy redesigning the hero course to worry about what one student was doing in the middle of the night, especially when that student was the black sheep of the class. It didn't take long for Katsuki to get outside the gates, considering that the security was meant to keep people out, not prevent students from escaping, and he popped a few explosions before heading off into the darkness. It was time for some small fry to feel the wrath of King Explosion Murder. Dabi looked out over the peacefully dark forest with a weird sense of déjà vu. The last time he had been there, half the trees had been burning bright blue and peace was the exact opposite emotion than he'd been trying to portray, but tonight it was nice. If it had been lighter, the old scorch marks on some of the trees would have still been visible, but even in the middle of the night Dabi could see the tall silhouettes of trees, more like husks now, whose limbs had been burned off that night. Those were good memories. He wasn't there to reminisce, however. No, Dabi was there to keep watch. Hey birdie, what's taking so long? Hawks barely flinched at the interruption and didn't even open his eyes. Dabi, you were raised by a pro hero. You know how hard it is to sneak things past us, especially since these ones are probably on high alert from the last time you were here. Do I need to remind you that if we hadn't been here then, we wouldn't be here now? Dabi smirked. Hawks huffed. That's part of the problem. I know that Mastermind's notebooks said this plan had potential, but he also said it was really risky. They might just blame the League and try to attack us on sight, or worse try to play double agent. You can recognize another double agent, can't you, birdie? Dabi teased. And seriously, I think we have enough tuna to be tempting. Cat jokes? Seriously? Hawks huffed and ruffled his wings in annoyance. If this works, I'm constantly going to have to be fending off stupid cat and bird jokes, aren't I? Why? Dabi leaned close to whisper in Hawk's ear. Are you excited to be hunted? Hawks opened his eyes and shoved Dabi away. He was scowling and was trying to be intimidating, but the way that his feathers had fluffed up to try and make him seem bigger just made Dabi laugh harder. He was too easy to tease sometimes. You're lucky I'd already finished. Hawks complained. If we'd gotten caught just because someone was more focused on fooling around than actually completing the mission. Yeah, Shigaraki would have our heads, yada, yada, yada. Dabi rolled his eyes. Now, pretty bird, are you gonna show me a whole new world or what? Hawks shook his head and grabbed Dabi so they could fly home. I hate you. Feelings mutual. Ochako hit the punching bag a little harder, ignoring the twinge in her forearm that was trying to warn her that she was going too hard as she reared back her other arm and punched again. Then again, until the only thing she could think about or feel was the ache in her muscles and everything else faded into the background like it was supposed to. She heard a noise behind her and spun around, already swinging a bruising punch at whatever villain was sneaking up on her this time. She didn't even care how they had gotten into UA, all she knew is that this time, she'd beat them. This time, she'd be strong enough. She had to be. By the time she'd realized it wasn't a villain at all, it was already too late to stop her momentum, and her eyes widened in a blind panic, but thankfully Tsu had enough presence of mind to dodge. Ochako stumbled a little as her punch hit thin air, but she'd trained enough in the past few months that he regained her balance almost immediately. Tsu looked at her with an almost blank expression that still managed to somehow be knowing as she held out a towel. Couldn't sleep? Ochako shrugged and smiled apologetically as she took the towel. I was just feeling a little restless is all. Sorry about almost taking your head off. Tsu just raised an eyebrow. It's okay to not be okay, you know. Anyone would be having nightmares after what you... I'm fine, Tsu. Ochako snapped, then sighed and collapsed onto the floor. I'm sorry, it's just that it was my own fault. I should have been more aware of the situation. There were clear red flags and I ignored them and Mastermind got the drop on me, that's it. None of us noticed his true colors. Tsu said patiently, moving to sit cross-legged next to her. Not even Bakugo noticed, and they were kids together. Maybe that's why he was too blind to see it, but the rest of us should have been able to figure it out. Ochako argued. Isn't Aizawa always going on about situational awareness and trusting our gut and... Tsu grabbed her hand. We're just first years, Ochako. And Midoriya was just a quirkless first year and look what he did. Ochako snarled. He killed so many people. He killed All Might in front of us, or did you just forget that? Tsu's eyes softened. Ochako? No, Ochako's eyes hardened in determination and she stood. No, there's no excuse. Mastermind might be behind bars, but we have to be the best heroes we can be, especially now that villains think they can do whatever they want. We have to be stronger than them. We have to keep people safe. We can do that tomorrow. Tsu tried. Right now, you need sleep and... Ochako shook her head. You go on ahead, I'll sleep a little later. It's 3 am. Tsu deadpanned. Ochako just smiled. I guess that means it's training time. Nedzu looked over his diagrams again, a feeling of pride welling up even though his project was nowhere near finished. Midoriya might pride himself on having all of society as his plaything, but he wasn't the only one who could play at that game. Mastermind may have changed the game, true, but he was a relatively new player in the scheme of things. He couldn't yet predict the tides of strategy or the ebb and flow of public opinion the way a master like Nedzu could do and had been doing for years, so while, yes, he was an excellent player, he didn't yet control the game. Society needed change, that much was obvious after recent events, but it also needed stability. People craved consistency and safety just as much as the freedom and anarchy that the villains stood for. The Hero Commission may have had its corruptions, but ultimately, it provided exactly the service that the people needed, even if they didn't know to ask for it. If they could keep the best parts of the old commission and create a new order that responded to the weaknesses that Midoriya had unveiled and then fortify them, perhaps they could build a society that was stronger and get back to the days where heroes thrived. Nedzu made a few more notes and drawings, pausing only to take a few sips of tea. The vigilante-style ideals that the League of Villains had grown to represent made fighting them that much harder, but Nedzu had never been one to back down from a challenge. People needed hope. They needed to believe that heroes would save them, and they needed a symbol of light to look toward when things get dark. Midoriya had deprived them of that symbol by killing All Might, and Hawks had been unable and unwilling to fill that role, but the chaos and despair made it obvious that such a symbol was necessary now more than ever. Nedzu just needed to find them and mold them into what the people needed it to be. He finished another set of diagrams and couldn't help smiling. This was not quite the game of chess that Nedzu had envisioned when he had started pushing for Mastermind's arrest, but he had to admit that this game Midoriya had pulled him into was much more fun. Manami flinched when Danjuro started rubbing the knots out of her shoulders. Gentle? What are you doing out of bed? Danjuro kept gently massaging her shoulders, then leaned down and gave her neck a soft kiss. I was just coming to check on the love of my life. You've been sitting at that screen since this morning, dearest. I know, I'm just... Manami stared listlessly at the same information that she'd been looking at for the past 3 hours. If my program had been just a little better, or if I'd had more redundancies or a couple more backups, then the heroes would still have found a way around it. Denjiro said firmly. I know you blame yourself for not doing more, dearest, we all do, but it's the heroes' job to catch villains. It's what they do. They were never going to stop going after young Mastermind, and there's nothing we can do to change the past. The tea has gone cold and all we can do now is brew a new cup. Manami sighed. I guess you're right. I just need to focus on getting him out now, I guess. Exactly. Now come here. Denjiro opened his arms and let Manami snuggle into the hug, almost tearing up at the familiar embrace. It will all turn out all right. I know. Manami sniffed. I love you. Denjiro smiled softly and she didn't even need to activate her quirk for the words to make him seem brighter and stronger. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head. I know, darling. I love you too. Mandalay couldn't stop staring at the note, even as it crumpled in her hand from how tightly she was gripping it. The note had shown up in the pages on her diary with no warning and no hint as to who could have put it there, all of which should be raising red flags as high as they could go, but Mandalay couldn't even process that as her brain latched onto the message, repeating it almost like a drum that beat in rhythm with her pounding heart. Don't you want revenge? Bakugo massaged out the soreness in his wrists and ignored the bags under his eyes as he pulled on his wrinkled UA uniform, leaving the tie hanging on the back of his desk chair to collect dust as usual. No one could even stand to look at him long enough to figure out he wasn't wearing a tie, much less take in the state of his uniform, so he wasn't too worried about his appearance. Classes had gotten a little bit harder since he'd begun his nightly excursions, but Katsuki could handle a little bit of tiredness and quirk fatigue, especially since it wasn't like he'd been sleeping before hitting the streets anyway. No one had called him out on it yet, but Bakugo was careful to avoid as many cameras as possible when leaving campus and keep his face covered whenever he was off it. It wasn't like he was doing anything illegal, just beating up some villains who deserved it, but he just knew the media vultures would probably love to sink their claws into his new hobby and somehow circle it back around to the rumors about him, and Deku and Katsuki was too tired for that sheet. They wouldn't be wrong in saying that he was out there because of Deku, but they'd probably get it all twisted and make Katsuki seem like the villain, when really the truth was just that Deku had gotten a big head and decided to forget that he was a quirkless weakling that wouldn't even cut it as a rent-a-cop, much less the #1 villain. Deku was a weakling. He'd always been a weakling, so all those stupid villains who had decided it was a free-for-all now that the Hero Commission was gone were even weaker than he was. They were good practice. And, yeah, maybe he wasn't being gentle with them. He was sure that Ito would probably have a conniption and insist that heroes were supposed to minimize injury or whatever, but Katsuki didn't see what the problem was. They were villains, he was a hero, and they deserved whatever was coming to them. If a couple would-be muggers went to jail with a broken arm or a few burns, it wasn't Katsuki's problem. That was on them for being villains. He kept his shoulders slumped as he ignored everyone at breakfast and made his way to homeroom. Kirishima still wasn't talking to him and it was really starting to get on his nerves. When everything first went down, he figured that once Shitty Hair got it out of his system, they'd be fine and back to being not friends again, but even after they'd destroyed a couple walls and both gotten a few good hits in, Kirishima still wasn't any better. He'd thought Shitty Hair of all people would be able to tell that Deku being an idiot wasn't his fault, but apparently he and everyone else were just like his old man and blamed him when he didn't even do anything wrong. Katsuki groaned and slumped down into his seat. Whatever, it wasn't like he cared about those extras' opinions anyway. The only thing he cared about was being the best, and no one was going to get in the way of that, not his parents, not Kirishima, and definitely not Deku. Ragdoll excused herself from dinner and practically ran to her room. It felt like things had been more tense the past few days, but she knew that was probably just her being paranoid. In truth, things had been more tense since she'd survived, at least, even though sometimes she wished she hadn't. She could see it in her teammates' eyes sometimes, the pity now that she was quirkless. They had assured her that they didn't think any less of her now, and that it wouldn't stop them from being friends, but she couldn't fight alongside them anymore. She couldn't help them save lives or stop villains. She was useless. And then to make it worse, Mastermind was finally revealed and Ragdoll hadn't been able to get the bitter taste out of her mouth as she realized that they were the same. They were both quirkless, even if she hadn't been born that way, and it disgusted her that they had something in common. She didn't want to have anything to do with him, which was probably why she hadn't thrown away the note she'd found inside one of her shoes, despite how suspicious it was, and was also probably why she'd hidden it away from her teammates instead of letting them know that there might have been an intruder. Don't you want to take back what was stolen from you? Nito Monoma looked out the window and allowed his mind to wander as Present Mike reviewed basic English grammar for the upteenth time. His grandfather had made sure he was fluent years ago, so now this time was either wasted, or he could put it to good use as he was doing right now and use it to strategize. He'd read over Mastermind's escape plans, and a consistent theme was that they were going to need all the manpower they could get to breach the walls of Tartarus. Villains would be helpful, of course, but most thugs and even some career criminals weren't going to be prepared to go against the technology in place around the island, not to mention the highly trained Tartarus guards and any heroes that came to their aid. No, breaking into Tartarus would need a team of elite criminals and, for maximum psychological damage, as many heroes as they could manage to turn. On the one hand, Nito could probably afford to ignore the issue entirely. Shigaraki was in charge of the League's doings outside UA, while Monoma's authority and expertise only extended to the front gates, and since adult heroes would be much more capable of breaking down Tartarus's defenses than a bunch of teenagers would be, then theoretically Monoma didn't actually need to be doing anything. Nito was naturally competitive and there was no way he was going to let Shudo, a former member of 1A, outdo him and take all the glory. Magna's plan for indoctrinating the next generation was still in the beginning stages, but Nito couldn't help smirking at how perfect it would be if there were UA students in attendance when those meetings actually started taking place. It would add so much credibility to their mission if, in addition to the normal riffraff that villains normally recruited, there were some famous hero students considering switching sides, so Nito had been keeping an eye out for anyone whose response had been less than enthusiastic since Mastermind's arrest. Bakugo, of course, was the most obvious choice. Nito didn't know if the teachers just hadn't noticed his new bruises or just chose to ignore them, but he was already starting to crack and it was only a matter of time before he snapped completely. If it had been anyone else, he definitely would have been Nito's first choice, but it was Bakugo. Not only was the guy absolutely insufferable, he had a history with Midoriya. If and when Mastermind escaped, he would resume his place as a trusted advisor to the League, and anyone who wasn't willing to listen to him, which Bakugo obviously wasn't, would be a loose cannon and a liability that the League couldn't afford. So Bakugo was out, but that didn't mean there weren't other options. Kendo, for example, had been more quiet than usual, so if he could stay close to her, even if it meant having to annoy one a little more, then he might be able to plant the right seeds to change her mind. There were a few other members of 1B that had expressed some dislike for Hero Society as well, but they weren't quite as promising, so he'd keep an eye on them and only make his move if anything changed, but he wasn't going to waste time focusing on them for now. And then there was the rest of 1A. Nito had been hopeful that Uraraka would go off the deep end after the way Nedzu had spun things at the press conference, but she seemed to have veered hard the other direction, so no dice. Most of them were still bitter after Shudo's betrayal, so it would take quite a bit of work to convince them to follow his lead, so Nito mentally filed them into the same group as his classmates. He'd observe and wait for now, then pounce the moment they showed any sign of entertaining the possibility of switching sides. The bell rang and Nito let himself be swept along with the wave of students making their way to the dorms. He caught a few glances of some 1A students as he walked, and almost face-bombed when he saw Tokoyami forcing his way against the crowd toward Hound Dog's office. How had he forgotten about that little gem? Tokoyami had always tended to isolate himself, especially when he was stressed, but it was even worse. Now that he felt like he was being singled out after everything that had happened at the summer camp and with Hawks. Nito hadn't missed the way that the rest of 1A looked at Tokoyami when they thought he wasn't looking, and he doubted that Tokoyami had missed it either, but people were scaredy cats and so quick to judge, especially when someone had been mentored by a villain. Sure, Hawks probably hadn't taught Tokoyami anything to encourage him to switch sides, especially since Nito knew that Hawks hadn't even been sure of his decision until the day he fully joined the League, but the stupid sheep in 1A didn't know that, and even if Tokoyami were to tell them that, they wouldn't trust him. No, those sidelong glances Nito caught during lunch and after joint training practices meant that there was more than one person who expected Hawk's little baby bird to be the next to turn. Nito smiled and made his way toward the teacher's dorms. It would only take a few nudges to push Tokoyami from the nest and make sure he flew in the right direction, and then both he and Dark Shadow would be invaluable assets for the league. Let Shudo try to compete with that. Nito shook his head and adjusted his backpack as he finally reached the teacher's dorms. This plan wasn't part of what Mastermind had left behind for them, but Nito couldn't resist no matter how risky it was. He'd have to do it the right way, of course, because if he had anything less than the best of intentions, then he had no doubt that Midoriya wouldn't hesitate to kill him or come up with an even worse punishment. Nito suppressed a small shudder at the thought. No, he needed to spin this in such a way that made it obvious that he was only trying to empower his target instead of manipulate or take advantage of her. It would be difficult, but Nito couldn't lie and say he didn't enjoy the challenge. He climbed the stairs and made his way down the hall until he reached the right door, then knocked and waited. It took a few moments, but soon enough, a tired Aizawa swung open the door. "Oh, Minoma. Right on time." "I'm sorry, did I wake you up from a nap?" Nito asked. "If you need, I can come back later." Aizawa shook his head. "No, it's fine. I need to make sure those idiots down at the police station don't mess up the new training, and that's on top of the paperwork Nedza gave me yesterday. I can't thank you enough for volunteering to watch her." "It's no big deal." Nito smiled and waved away his concerns. "You've got a lot on your plate, and I'm sure it's nice to have a few hours to just catch up on everything." Aizawa groaned and led Nito down the hall, knocking quietly on one of the bedroom doors before he opened it slowly. "Hey sweetie, your babysitter's here." Nito smiled and crouched down so that he was at eye level for Eri, who looked up from her coloring to stare at him with wide eyes. "Hey there Eri, are you ready to have some fun?" Tamura grinned as everyone got into their positions. This particular quest was a little overdue. With all the preparations for their Tartarus quest, it had gotten delayed. But now it was time to make sure that Japan hadn't let itself forget that there were still important players online, even if Mastermind was AFK for the moment. It was time for the League of Villains to declare to the world we're still here. And what better way to do that than to get a little good old-fashioned revenge on one of the parties that had led Midoriya to the dark side. Aldra Middle School thought they were so clever, destroying all evidence of the abuse so that the police wouldn't legally be able to prove anything. But they had forgotten one of the major truths in the underground. Everyone had enemies. The people who ran that school might be despicable human beings, but they were casuals when it came to the nightmares lurking on the wrong side of the law that didn't need proof to take action. No, the boss music had already started playing, and maybe if they'd remembered that there were monsters out there much worse than the police, they could have equipped some weapons or skills or even logged off entirely. Maybe then they would have had a chance to survive. Not that Tamura's party would have let them. He turned to Hawks and nodded sharply. Hawks grinned, a sharp smile that fit him much better than the fake ones the commission always made him wear for the camera, and launched himself into the air. He circled the school like a vulture, which was, of course, the signal to begin. Away from the action, Mr. Compress started to stream from Gentle Criminal's channel, zooming in on their fallen hero as Dabi set the practice fields alight and Shudo iced all of the doors shut except one. Twice's army of clones was making its way through the classrooms to lead away the students while clones of Toga gathered the teachers and administrators at knife point. Mange and Spinner manned the only available exit, greeting the students as they escaped and making sure none of the people in charge left the building. Screams echoed from the building as Tamura's plan was finally set in motion. He'd never admit it out loud, but one of the main reasons why it had taken them weeks to get around to this battle was because Tamura wasn't sure his plan would work. Basically, from the moment he'd debuted at the USJ attack, Midoriya had been there to offer course correction when needed. He'd been stuck in tutorial mode, but now it was time for him to fully control the gameplay. That didn't mean he had to be annoying about it. He'd always made the plans, Mastermind had just perfected them and taken them to the next level. So Tamura didn't see why his party couldn't do the same. Sure, they weren't specialists like Mastermind was, but when they'd gone over the plan, Shudo had brought up that the plan had a bug that could nerf their reputation if they weren't careful, so Shigaraki had listened to his teammates' suggestions for how to patch it. Toxin. Magna had both pointed out that most of the kids were probably innocent, and Spinner had laughed that those who weren't would probably get scared straight watching everything go down, so they should just evacuate the kids instead of killing them. Even without Mastermind, Tamura managed to fix the bug and would be able to keep their party's reputation as vigilantes instead of pure villains. A crowd of teenagers flooded from the front doors and were corralled by a wall of ice from Shudo on one side and a wall of fire from Dabi on the other, while Hawk's feathers kept any onlookers or police from getting too close, and Toga led the teachers up the stairs. There was a whoosh of air and Hawks landed in a crouch beside him. Twice said all the students are out. Well, part of him did, but Toga confirmed that part, and my feathers didn't find anyone we missed, so. Tamura grinned. Let's move on to the next stage then. His stomach dropped as one of Hawk's feathers grabbed him and flew him over to land on top of the building, right in the middle of the crowd. Around him, other members of the League were arriving as well. Every villain that set foot on the rooftop made the crowd of sniveling cowards panic a little more as they were surrounded and pushed further and further out toward the edges, eyes wide as they scrambled to get away from the arriving villains. There were yells from below as another wall of ice sprang up and prevented any students from running back toward the building when Shudo and Dabi joined them. Mr. Compress was the last person to arrive, and he held the phone up and sounded like he was smiling behind his mask as he addressed anyone watching. Hello, Japan. I do hope you hadn't forgotten about us. We would like to thank Gentle Criminal for allowing us to commandeer his channel for the afternoon, and hope this collab will be to your satisfaction, because I assure you that we will be having a blast. Compress flung his arm out to the side and spun in a wide circle to show their current captives. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our current location, allow me to set the scene. We are on the roof of one Aldra Middle School, an establishment you may very well have heard of in recent weeks, because here, my dear viewers, is where our very own captive symbol of freedom, Mastermind, received his education. The principal tried to interrupt, probably to deny Compress's allegations or plead for mercy. Tamura didn't quite care which, but Compress simply shushed him and continued his monologue. They tried to hide it, but the truth is that these men and women helped make Mastermind what he is today. They were the ones who ignored and encouraged his abuse and ensured that he was so broken that his only choice was to build himself back up again. They are the root of your hero's downfalls and one of the rotting aspects of society that has been hidden and allowed to fester for too long under the Hero Commission's rule. Tamura was grateful that so many of his party had a talent for showmanship, because he personally hated it. It wasn't something that came naturally to him, and who wanted to see a crusty gamer on TV? But it was useful. Speeches like the one Compress just gave could turn the tide of public opinion in their favor faster than even killing the right heroes could, and Tamura wasn't about to ignore skills that could help the League level up. Still, he tried to ignore the camera as much as he could as he looked around and took in everyone's faces. The teachers were terrified, obviously, and some were crying, but he didn't have any sympathy for them. They had stood by and added to the abuse Midoriya was suffering when they should have been saving him, and it set Tamura off. Who did they think they were? They made their own beds, so why should they have any right to be scared when they were just reaping their just rewards? The League's faces were the exact opposite. Tamura couldn't think of a single member of his party that hadn't been cast off and abused by the same society that had enabled these monsters to prey on the children under their care, so it wasn't any surprise that every single one of their expressions was hardened with pure rage. When they looked at the staff of Aldra Middle School, each of them saw their own abusers standing there on the edges of the roof instead. They had been the ones cowered in fear for their entire lives, so it was past time for them to stand up for themselves and turn the tables. Izuku Midoriya went to school here every day for 3 years. Tamura said softly. And all that time, you never listened. You didn't listen when he was called useless or Deku or a quirkless waste of space. You didn't even listen when his classmates told him to jump off this very roof. The rooftop had gone silent except for the quiet whimpering of their hostages, and the atmosphere was tense as everyone waited on his words. Tamura was aware that Compress had panned the camera to him at some point, but he just crouched down, using a fingernail to scratch at the dirt caked over the old concrete. He let the fear and tension build for another long moment, smiling slightly when he felt one of Hawk's feathers anchor itself on his shirt, and then Tamura looked up at the principal of Aldra High, who turned pale and was shaking like a piece of prey that had finally realized it had been cornered by a lion, and said, "So why don't you take a swan dive off the roof and hope you'll be better in the next life?" Tamura didn't think he ever wanted to forget the look on the principal's face as he flattened his hand and the entire building collapsed into dust beneath them. Tiger watched the news as it replayed the destruction for the upteen time. The dark shapes of the League's members rose above the ruined school and Hawks's feathers carried them all away before the dust could even settle. Personally, he felt conflicted over the whole thing. On the one hand, their callous attitude and the ease with which they killed proved that they were pure evil, and Tiger couldn't sympathize with that. But on the other, he'd met kids who had passed through that school. They encouraged a culture of toxic superiority, and anyone who was different or couldn't advance the school's reputation was tossed underfoot, useful only in the ways they could bolster those at the top, and crushed under the weight of the entire oppressive atmosphere that the school called a culture. He had wanted to be surprised when the rumors started going around about how they had treated Mastermind as a child, but he'd met with too many kids who were treated almost as badly for being trans or gay, so he'd lost faith that the schools would actually care for those children who found themselves in the minority. It was honestly a miracle that more of them didn't lash back at the world like Mastermind had, not that that would probably help anything. The world had been broken for a long time now, so it was more realistic to just try and find happiness than to fix it. He turned off the TV and one hand ran through his hair while the other fingered the crumpled note he'd shoved in his pocket almost a week ago. "Don't you want to live in a world where you'll be accepted without question?" Fumikage was unhappy and Dark Shadow didn't like it. It wasn't just because he could constantly feel the unhappiness through their bond, though that was obviously part of it, but the simple fact was that he just didn't like seeing his best friend depressed like this. Fumikage had been with him for as long as he could remember and had put up with his mood swings and having to share his body with another entity, and yet he'd never resented Dark Shadow for anything. He didn't deserve to be treated with suspicion because of who his mentor was or even because Dark Shadow had lost control and hurt someone at that nightmare of a training camp. The constant side-eyes were getting exhausting, and the only thing that kept Dark Shadow from being consumed with rage was the knowledge that Fumikage would be able to feel it through their bond. He hadn't even thought Hawks had been that bad. If anything, he was fun to be around and had been helping pull Fumikage out of his edginess by providing some much-needed brightness to his worldview. Of course, that had been completely shut down, and Dark Shadow could feel the way that Fumikage's thoughts whirled around and eventually shut down as he tried to reconcile the bright chicken nugget they'd turned under with the hardened villain the news talked about. Hawks couldn't have changed that much overnight, right? Dark Shadow curled up in Fumicage's lap and let him slide his beak even as he wrapped around the branch they were sitting on to make sure Fumikage didn't fall off. The branches provided enough shadows that they both felt comfortable despite the afternoon sun, and the height, ironically, kept them grounded. Hawks had been right after all. They were birds, and birds were meant to fly. Climbing the trees also gave Fumikage a lot more privacy than he would get hanging out in the dorms after school. In the dorms, like in the hallways at school, there were always eyes and whispers, or the threat of them, at least, and it made Dark Shadow want to go crazy. He kinda understood how Mastermind could have fallen into villainy if people refused to let him prove himself like they were starting to do to Fumikage. Some days, Dark Shadow just wanted to rip out the throat of the next person to imply Fumikage was awful as soon as they thought they were out of earshot. But even more than an escape or a hideaway, the trees felt like home, which was probably why Dark Shadow growled defensively when someone started to climb up, making the leaves rustle as they disturbed the peaceful silence and came into their home uninvited. "Down, Dark Shadow," Fumikage ordered quietly. He didn't say anything else, but Dark Shadow could feel the worry across their bond. He was worried that if Dark Shadow growled at the intruder, that would be one more tally in the villain column, which was absolutely ridiculous. Reluctantly, Dark Shadow settled back into his place on Fumicage's lap, but he refused to relax completely. He would have felt bad about it if Fumikage wasn't tense and ready for a fight too. It wasn't long until a blonde head of hair poked up through the leaves. "What, did being around 1A get too exhausting? What are you doing here, Monoma?" Fumikage complained. "I thought you hated our class." "No, I hate 1A as a whole." That doesn't mean I can't sometimes tolerate individual members. Monoma drawled. And I'm a UA student too, so I'm just as welcome in these trees as you are. Then find your own tree. Dark Shadow grumbled quietly. Don't be like that. Monoma pouted. Maybe I should take back my statement if a member of 1A is too selfish to even share his tree. It's fine, Dark Shadow. Fumikage was still eyeing Monoma suspiciously, but he hadn't made fun of them yet or treated them like future villains, so maybe having him here wouldn't be terrible. You are welcome to enjoy your inner darkness alongside us if you so choose. Monoma grinned and settled onto one of the branches, closing his eyes to better enjoy the stillness of the afternoon. It was a few more minutes until Dark Shadow and Fumikage were able to relax as well, but the longer their company stayed without offending them, the less intrusive he appeared. Sure, Monoma may have been an uninvited guest, but maybe he wasn't quite as bad as they'd been afraid of when they weren't around the rest of the hero students. Dark Shadow lost track of how long they sat there before Monoma broke the silence again. Things have been insane lately. Almost makes you wonder what's right and wrong anymore. Dark Shadow bristled. If you're just gonna make snide comments about Fumikage, you can leave. Dark Shadow. Fumikage scolded, frustration and a tinge of fear making their way to him through the bond. Monoma didn't seem to mind his outburst, however, because he just raised his hands in surrender. I was talking about me. Or well, everyone really. Think about it. We all thought the Hero Commission was there to protect us, but look how that turned out. The villains are obviously not in the right. I mean, they're killing people, but like, they destroyed a school just to stop some bullies. It's confusing is all I'm saying. I don't even know who's right at this point. Maybe no one is. Fumikage offered after a moment. Maybe everyone is wrong and the correct path is destined to remain hidden from human eyes. Monoma raised an eyebrow. Seems kinda pessimistic, doesn't it, edgelord? Fumikage shrugged, more nihilistic, but perhaps you're right. Perhaps the darkness of the current world is simply overshadowing my own inner darkness and blocking out the light of hope. Maybe. Monoma frowned thoughtfully. It's something to think about at least. But, hey, if you ever want to talk more about it, I know a couple of kids that are open to have discussions. We might not be able to really make the world make sense, but maybe we can at least sort the truth from the propaganda we'd been fed our whole lives. You're always welcome, and who knows? You might even learn something. Dark Shadow could feel Fumicage's pleasant surprise, but then again, maybe it was his own. He hadn't thought that Monoma was capable of being polite, much less willing to discuss philosophy and able to treat Fumikage like an equal instead of a threat, unlike some of his own classmates. Maybe having company wasn't so bad after all. I'll consider it. Fumikage answered finally. Having more friends to help navigate the darkness would not be unwelcome. Monoma smiled. I completely agree. Dinner was even more silent and awkward than it usually was, and Mandalay knew it was her fault. Ever since she'd found that stupid note, she just hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. She was a hero, she shouldn't want revenge, but Muscular had taken so much from her. He had wiped out an entire family, and all he got was a prison sentence while she got a lifetime of pain and guilt that she couldn't save them. She couldn't believe that she was even considering it, but it wasn't as if anything would come of her more violent fantasies. Muscular was locked away in Tartarus where even a hero wouldn't be able to reach him. She flinched as Pixie Bob suddenly slammed her hands down on the table. That's it. I am so sick of everyone moping and keeping secrets from each other. We're a team, so let's just take the bull by the horns and get this the hell over with. She glared at each of them, the expression emphasizing the puckered scar that ran across her face. Who else received a creepy note last week? And don't you dare lie to me. Mandalay's mouth went dry. Pixie Bob knew about the note. Had she accidentally broadcasted something with telepathy? Did the others know about what she wanted to do to Muscular, even if it wasn't possible? Were they going to abandon her for it? Was this going to be the final straw that finally caused them to break up? Wait, did she say who else? Ragdoll almost sighed in relief. I thought I was the only one. You got one too. Pixie Bob nodded. I'll go grab it. Anyone else need to get theirs? Mandalay nodded numbly and stood, followed quickly by Ragdoll. But Tiger just shook his head and pulled something out of his pocket. I've got mine right here. Pretty creepy that they just showed up like that. How did you know we all got one? Regulus. Did you leave them? What? Pixie Bob looked genuinely offended. Why would I do something like that? Didn't you notice? Mandalay eyed her suspiciously. Notice what? Pixie Bob stared at them in shock. Are you serious? None of you noticed the letters? Whatever, I'll explain in a minute. It'll be easier to show you anyway. She rushed from the room and Mandalay only hesitated for a moment before running to grab her own note. Her mind raced, but even she couldn't make sense of her thoughts as she unlocked the box under her bed and took out the paper that already looked worn out from how many times she'd read it. By the time she got back, Tiger and Ragdoll were already waiting for her, their own notes sitting heavily on the table in front of them. Seconds later, Pixie Bob ran back into the room and slammed her note onto the table. Some of the letters are in a different font, but mine don't make any sense and I already sent dust bunnies to search the rest of the house and they didn't find anything, so I figured someone had the rest of the message and it was probably you all, but then no one said anything and I almost thought I was going crazy. Mandalay grabbed the note and held it up so that the others could read it too. Don't you feel like you were our OBBEDOF the best years of your life? EYOURBOY. Pixie Bob said out loud. It might say something like your boy or something, but why? And what's with the extra E? Tiger cleared his throat awkwardly. I think I might know. I noticed the different font, but I just thought the note was being purposely ominous, which would make sense if this was a prank or a villain trying to get under our skin. He pushed the note toward them so they could see what it said. Don't you want to live in a world where you would be accepted? Oh, Tiger. Mandalay grabbed his hand. You know that we accept you, right? We haven't done anything to make you doubt that, have we? No, I know you all accept me, but the world at large is a different story. Tiger sighed. But that's not what's important right now. It spells out died, hence why I wrote it off as a fear tactic. But combined with your boy. You think it's referring to Coda? Mandalay whispered. It would make sense. Pixie Bob said gently. It was a tragedy and whatever the note-writer's goal is, referencing. Coda's death would be sure to make an emotional impact. It's a gut punch. Tiger growled. A cheap shot. We found his body in the mountains near here, right? Regulus. I think the extra E in Pixie Bob's might be a clue to my message. She scooted her chair back so the others could lean in and read her note. Don't YOUW ant to take back WH it was stole ENFROMU? How would you even? Mandalay frowned. All for one is in Tartarus, and it's not like you can just force him to give search back. No, Ragdoll said shortly. I can't. There was a tense moment of silence before Tiger cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, adding Pixie Bob's E to the end of your message would spell out where, but there's still an extra letter. Which letters were weird in your note, Mandalay? None of them. Mandalay answered helplessly. I didn't even know that you all were getting notes, much less that I was supposed to be looking for different letters. Maybe you just didn't notice? Pixie Bob suggested. I mean, the ones in mine were pretty obvious, but it's possible you just didn't register them when you were reading the note. Maybe. She'd read the note so many times, she had it memorized, so if there were a bunch of letters spelling something out, she would have seen them, right? You just need a fresh pair of eyes. Ragdoll offered. Can we see the note? Mandalay hesitated. The others' notes were all good things. Getting back Ragdoll's stolen quirk, letting Tiger be accepted for who he was, mourning Pixie Bob's lost youth. All of them were ominous and thought-provoking, sure, but none of them were as obviously villainous as hers was. Mandy. Tiger put a large hand on her shoulder. You were Coda's flesh and blood, you have a right to feel whatever you're feeling right now. Whatever that note says, we're not gonna judge you for it, and we're not gonna love you any less. Mandalay only lasted a few seconds before her resolve crumbled under the kind eyes of her teammates, and she shoved her note toward them. Fine. Have it. Go nuts. Don't you want revenge? She stared at the ground as they read, waiting for their perfect image of her to break. Sure, they'd said they wouldn't judge her, but she wouldn't blame them if they did. God knows she was judging herself more harshly than they possibly could. Well, I see why you didn't notice it, Ragdoll said finally. You only had one letter and it only makes sense with the other notes. What? Mandy didn't know if she was more surprised that her teammates were ignoring the elephant in the room or that her note actually had been part of the hidden message. Which one? It's the letter G, Pixie Bob said. Does anyone have a piece of paper? One that's not the notes, I mean. Here. Tiger pulled out a notebook. I grabbed it while you were off getting your notes. I'll write down what we have that we think Mandy's message is first and mine is last, correct? Ragdoll nodded, then mine and Pixie's are. In the middle. Well, if we were looking for answers, I don't think we're going to get them. Tiger said. All this gives us is more questions. He tore the page out of the notebook and they all crowded around it to read the secret message. Go where your boy died. Katsuki grinned as the wind whipped the smoke around him. The worthless thug at his feet hadn't even seen him coming before Katsuki was launching an explosion at his head. He hadn't even stood a chance against King Explosion Murder and people were saying that Deku of all people was dangerous? It was ridiculous. It was getting late and Katsuki rubbed his eyes tiredly, grimacing as he realized that he had just rubbed soot and ash all over his face. That had been happening a lot recently. Most of the time, his explosions didn't produce too much of a mess on their own, but whatever they destroyed did, and Katsuki had been destroying a lot recently and he didn't always remember when he'd gotten too close and gotten his hands covered in the stuff. Whatever, he'd just have to shower when he got back to the dorms or something, no big deal. He was just about to head back when he heard someone yell behind him. Stop, villain. Katsuki smirked and flexed his fingers. Another one? This was his lucky day. He was confused, however, when he looked around for the threat and the only other person he could see was Death Arms, who was staring right at him. You shouldn't get a guy's hopes up like that. Katsuki growled. I was looking forward to have someone to beat up. Figures you'd just be some meathead crying wolf. Halt. Death Arms lowered himself into a fighting stance. I'm taking you in, villain, do not resist. Katsuki just looked at him like he'd grown two heads. Wait, are you talking to me? I don't see any other villains here. Death Arms bit out. Except perhaps that poor man you almost killed. Katsuki rolled his eyes and kicked the already downed villain. Don't be an idiot, this a-hole be fine. More importantly, who are you calling a villain? I'm a hero just like you are. Death Arms' eyes narrowed. Excessive force counts as villainy, especially in half-baked vigilantes like yourself who never could have gotten a license. What did you say? Katsuki snarled, launching himself forward before he could think better of it. I'm effing hero. Not some goddamn villain, got it? I'm better than all of you. He didn't even get the chance to let off an explosion before Death Arms swatted him aside like a fly. He went flying down a side street and through a window, the crash echoing as Katsuki hissed and took stock of the damage. He had more cuts than he could count, including a few on his hands that would make his explosions painful, and he was pretty sure he'd sprained his wrist and at least one of his ankles. He could hear Death Arms pounding down the street after him and he swore as he ran. Heroes weren't supposed to run, but heroes also weren't supposed to chase other heroes either. Aizawa had said making retreats was alright when someone was too injured to continue the fight, so it wasn't like he was just running away because he was afraid of losing. He just needed to recover, regroup, and then he'd make Death Arms regret ever insulting him. He managed to slip away, partially because Death Arms was too bulky to chase him without giving away his location. Katsuki let his rage distract him from the pain as he made his way back to the dorms and patched himself up. He was a hero or maybe a vigilante, but he'd proved to that stupid hero that there was no way in hell he was a villain. The cliff looked far less intimidating in the light of day, but Mandalay still couldn't stop the memory that superimposed itself over the peaceful scene like a storm cloud. The memory of the same Sif covered in red mud instead of dust combined with the slow realization that it hadn't rained. She felt Ragdoll's hand on her arm like an anchor and took a deep breath. What are we looking for anyway? Most likely another clue. Tiger said. Whoever left us those notes had no way of knowing how long it would take to put them all together, so it would be impractical of them to be waiting here for us. We'll probably find some kind of invitation. Pixie Bob spat. Are we sure we even want to figure this out? Whoever left us these notes, it's probably not a hero. You're the one who suggested putting them together. Mandalay snapped. I was curious. Pixie Bob whined. Yes, well, you have to admit that you still are. Ragdoll pointed out. We all are. Those notes they made a lot of promises. Tiger finished. If you ladies want, we can leave now. Or we can follow this and figure out if these mystery writers can actually follow through on those. Either way, we should do it as a team. Mandalay shook her head, trying to clear away the memories like an etch-a-sketch. It didn't work, but then again, she hadn't really expected it to. Let's just keep going. If we find them, we don't have to listen. We can arrest them on the spot if we want to. Her teammates nodded in agreement and they spread out, looking for anything that didn't belong. She would look for anything that was different or had changed, but she hadn't been back here since Kuda died, so she probably wasn't the best judge of that. She just wanted to find the clue and get out of here already. This entire place just made her skin crawl. I found something. Ragdoll cried out, her voice echoing as she ran out of the cave. It's a map of Tokyo. Any clue of where we're supposed to go? Mandalay asked. Or what we're supposed to do when we get there? Pixie Bob added. Well, there's a star. Ragdoll pointed to the map. But this was in the tube I found as well. Is that seriously a glow stick? Pixie Bob laughed. They gave us cryptic notes and a glow stick. I can see some writing on the side, which means it isn't the glow stick itself that's important. Tiger came up and took it from Ragdoll. It's what it represents. He tilted it so they could clearly see the writing. Promises. Promises? Ragdoll asked. What's that supposed to mean? Isn't it obvious? Mandalay felt slightly nauseous. Glow sticks are meant to be broken. Sue was concerned about Ochako. It had taken a full week and Mina's intervention to get her to even agree to come out this afternoon instead of training, but she still wasn't off duty. Even as they sipped their boba tea, Ochako's eyes swept the room in a clear display of hypervigilance and her body looked calm, but Sue knew her well enough to read the tension. She was waiting. She was expecting a villain to pop out at any moment and there was no way that Ochako would let herself be caught off guard when they did. Not again. Sue let out a small croak. Maybe going off campus hadn't been the best plan, but it was the first thing she thought of doing to keep Ochako from burning out. Whenever she was at UA, she was training, and even when they were just hanging out in the dorms, she had weights and other tools stashed everywhere, or she would float the couch during movie nights as extra practice. It was exhausting just to watch, and Sue couldn't even imagine how Ochako was still standing. But there was nothing she could do. Not really. Ochako wouldn't even admit that anything was wrong, and when Sue had suggested she visit Hound Dog, just to be safe, she'd simply laughed and assured her that everything was fine. All Sue could do was be there and stand by Ochako so she wasn't alone. It made her feel almost helpless, but what else was she supposed to do when her friend wouldn't let them help her? Did you see what Ciro did to Kaminari's room yesterday? Sue finally broke the silence. I heard Mina had to use her acid to cut through all the tape. It's good quirk practice, I guess. Ochako shrugged. But it doesn't seem like heroes should be using their quirks for pranks like that. You've been hanging around Ida too much. Sue croaked. They're just having a little fun, it's not hurting anybody. I guess, Ochako said hesitantly, sipping at her tea before stopping suddenly. Did you hear that? Sue tilted her head slightly and listened intently. It was barely audible, especially underneath the chatter of the other patrons at the boba shop, but as she focused on the sound, it seemed to get closer. Her heart sank. Of course the noise had to be sirens. As if Ochako really needed more proof that villains could attack at any time. We're in the middle of the city. Sue pointed out uselessly. It could just be an ambulance. Maybe someone had a heart attack. Ochako shook her head. Ambulance sirens are different. Those are police. Let's go. She leapt up and tossed her boba in the trash on the way out the door, despite the fact that she'd only drunk a quarter of it. Sue sighed as she followed suit and ran down the street after Ochako. The sirens were much louder now, so they were definitely headed their way and, quickly, They weren't even halfway down the street when a car skidded around the corner and they could see someone with a light-based quirk shooting something out of one of the rear windows. A high-speed chase. Ochako muttered. Come on, they can't go anywhere if their wheels aren't touching the ground. It's basic physics. Tsu's eyes widened. It's also basic common sense to not go charging at a moving car. Ochako didn't listen. She wasn't even in her hero costume, but she ran straight toward the car anyway, basically standing in its path as she stared it down. The car honked, but didn't stop moving. Tsu shot out her tongue to grab her away, but at the last moment, Ochako reached out and heaved her arms upward as she activated her quirk. The sirens were the only sound on the street as the car launched up and over Ochako's head. She watched it arc and shook out the soreness in her arms as Tsu snapped out of her shock and lassoed a few civilians out of the way to give the car a place to land. Ochako glared at the villains in the car even as she brought her hands together. Release. The car fell to the floor with a crash and the two of them rushed toward the car, easily apprehending the disoriented villains as they crawled away from the wreckage. The police showed up almost immediately and took over so they could put the villains in HNDCFFS and get them to the station. Tsu stood silently beside Ochako, who still refused to relax as she watched the police lead them away. Instead, she just flexed her hands and looked hard at the villains. She didn't even look satisfied at a job well done, just determined to keep going and beat every villain in Japan. The crowd was eating it up. Miss. Miss. A reporter called out, a camera lens appearing from his hand as he took pictures. Would you care to answer a few questions? I assure you that your hero name won't be mentioned in the article if that's a concern. What gave you the courage to stand in front of a moving car like that? Ochako turned toward the reporter, her face hardened in determination as she answered. The people of Japan deserve to be safe, don't they? Aizawa will kill us if we give a full interview. Tsu muttered as she grabbed at Ochako's arm. Come on, we gotta get back to school. Thankfully, Ochako let herself get dragged along, but Tsu didn't miss the way people looked after them hopefully, even as they disappeared down a side street. If Japan were looking for a symbol of hope, she had the sinking feeling that they'd just found one. Living with the League was worlds apart from being raised by the Hero Commission. It was better, obviously, but there were still moments when it took some getting used to. He was living with a hideout full of murderers, so logically, they should be at each other's throats constantly, threatening to kill one another and having to seek underground medical attention when fights came to blows. But, except for on rare occasions, it wasn't like that at all. For the most part, they bonded over their shared trauma and what society had put them through, and they took care of each other. It was just still so weird that he had always instinctively frozen in fear whenever he saw one of his handlers, but he could walk around a house full of killers just fine. That's not to say that everything was perfect. Fights still broke out, but they were mostly about whose turn it was to go steal another game controller after Shigaraki dusted one of theirs, and if it came to blows, it was because they had decided to settle the argument with a spar. It felt like more of a family than Kigo had ever had. More than anything, the League took care of each other and they didn't shame each other as they recovered from the various traumas they'd gone through before their time in the League. A lot of them, including Kigo and the Todoroki brothers, had been forced to grow up far too fast and had never really had a chance to just be kids before they got crushed by the entire weight of the world. So, Kigo supposed that he really shouldn't be surprised that there had been a silent agreement to make up for lost time. Are you sure about this? He glanced at Toga suspiciously. You're not just telling me to do this because you want to see me bloodied up, are you? This is a universal experience, Hawks. Toga rolled her eyes dramatically. Just get on the mattress and let me push you down the stairs already. You do realize that if anything goes wrong, you can just fly away, right? Dabi was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, smirking at Kigo as he watched him make a fool of himself. What else are those pretty little wings for if not for keeping you safe while you do stupid stunts? Kigo couldn't help blushing even as he shot Dabi a glare. For your information, they're wings, not airbags for sledding inside. What if I run into a wall? Then I'll record it. Shudo volunteered, already holding up his phone. Never mind, I'll do that anyway. Gotta have blackmail when Izuku gets back. Come on, I thought you were a hawk, not a chicken. Kigo glared at him before sitting down cross-legged on the mattress that Spinner had found in a dumpster last time he'd gone out. He took a deep breath and nodded for Toga to push him, but immediately panicked as soon as the mattress actually started inching forward. Wait! Are you even sure this is safe? This is ridiculous. Dabi rolled his eyes and pushed himself off the wall. Come on, pretty bird, let's go. Kigo was about to ask what he meant when Dabi charged forward and jumped onto the mattress behind him, wrapping his arms around Kigo's waist as the momentum of his landing pushed the mattress far enough forward for gravity to take hold. Kigo gave a distressed chirp and gripped the mattress tightly as they bounced roughly down the stairs. Dabi laughed loudly behind him, and he could hear the rest of the league cheering them on from the top of the stairs as air rushed past. It wasn't that different from flying, honestly, and Kigo knew he had no right to be scared of such a simple thing, especially when Dabi was right. He could use his feathers to bail out at any moment. But the Hero Commission had tried to ingrain in him a sense of risk and reward. Anything reckless or frivolous was shamed out of him in favor of creating the perfect hero, so using an old ratty mattress to slide down the stairs had been entirely out of the question. Kigo grinned. That was then, but this was now, and now Kigo was free. Birdie, Dabi breathed in his ear. Those feathers might be a good idea right about now? Kigo looked back at him in confusion. What? Dabi jerked his chin forward and Kigo looked ahead only to realize that, yes, they were about to run into the wall. For some reason, though, he decided that rather than get whiplash by using his feathers to pull them to a sudden stop, he bailed sideways, and since Dabi was still holding on to him, he came with. The two of them tumbled across the landing and ended up coming to a stop in a mess of tangled limbs and feathers as the mattress hit the wall with a soft thud. Kigo smiled as he tried to catch his breath, only to suddenly lose the ability to breathe as he realized that Dabi had somehow ended up on top of him during the landing process. To make it worse, Dabi was just as out of breath as he was, and the a-hole was smirking down at him, bracing his arm right by Kigo's head to prop himself up. So, Birdie, what did you think? Pretty fun, right? All Kigo could manage was a nod and a strangled chirp before Shudo's shout reached them. That was awesome? How much do you want to bet that would go viral if we posted it on YouTube? Like they'd let it stay up more than 5 minutes. Spinner scoffed. We're villains, they'd take it down before it could get any traction. Dabi managed to untangle himself and offered a hand to help Kigo up as he sent a few feathers to carry the mattress back up the stairs. Alright, the league had a point. This activity might be frivolous and reckless, but it was definitely worth it. Alright, Shiggy, you're up. Toga yelled. No. Shiggy. Get back here. It's your turn. Fumikage waited at the gates for Monoma to show up, dark shadow around his shoulders like a protective parrot. His quirk hadn't said anything, but Fumikage could tell that he had been protective latefly, choosing to remain by his shoulders or on his lap even in sunlight, rather than tucked inside his chest like what would have been normal a few months ago. Fumikage silently appreciated the effort. It was always nice to have a visual reminder that he wasn't as alone as he felt sometimes. The sun was setting by the time Monoma showed up, but to Fumikage's surprise, he wasn't alone. Eri was holding his hand and hurrying along beside him, staring at Dark Shadow with large eyes as they got closer. Fumikage frowned. Was a political discussion group really the best place for a small? Sorry, Aizawa had a last-minute patrol. Monoma explained. And I promised Eri ice cream on the way. Don't worry, Aizawa's already approved it. I told him you'd be coming along, so she's going to have 2 strong heroes to protect her. Isn't that right, Eri? 3. Eri corrected softly. Monoma looked at Fumikage in confusion, but when he just shrugged, Monoma turned back to Eri. What do you mean? Eri looked a little insecure, but dutifully pointed to Monoma. 1. She moved her finger to point at Fumikage. 2. She paused for a moment, looking to Monoma for permission to continue. When he nodded encouragingly, she quietly pointed at Dark Shadow. 3. Fumikage's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but he smiled as he felt Dark Shadow puff up, his happiness contagious through their link. Despite everything she'd been through in her short life, Eri still managed to be an extremely sweet little girl. Dark Shadow apparently felt the same way, because he left his place on Fumicage's shoulder and butted his beak playfully against her hand. Eri's eyes widened and she took a frightened step back, clinging to Monoma's shirt as she peeked out from behind his back. Monoma laughed. "How silly of me to forget Dark Shadow. Of course there's 3 of us." He crouched down and spoke softly as he ran a hand through Eri's hair. "Hey, there's no need to be scared. Dark Shadow's not going to hurt you." Eri peeked around Monoma and Dark Shadow gave her a thumbs up. She looked like she was considering it for a brief moment, then buried her face in Monoma's shoulder. Fumicage stood there awkwardly, unsure if he and Dark Shadow should just go home. He didn't want to make Eri uncomfortable, especially if she'd heard the rumors going around that he was just a villain waiting to turn. With her history, she had even more reason to be terrified of villains than the rest of them did. She and Monoma were having a whispered conversation that Fumicage couldn't quite make out, but after a few minutes, Monoma smiled. "I could borrow your quirk and show you? How about that?" Eri hesitated a moment, then gave a quick nod. Monoma reached out and touched her hair, a horn growing out of his head the moment he did so. He shrugged apologetically as he turned back to them. "Eri's afraid she's going to hurt Dark Shadow. Her quirk can be a little scary sometimes, but that's okay. Just because something is scary doesn't mean you have to be scared of it." "Yeah," Dark Shadow said excitedly. "I'm a scary quirk too, but I'm not gonna hurt you. And I don't think you're gonna hurt me either." He rushed forward and leaned into Monoma's touch as he scratched his beak. "See, Eri? You have great control of your quirk. You're not gonna hurt him." Fumicage nodded encouragingly as Eri shyly lifted her hand. Dark Shadow moved slowly, giving Eri plenty of time to snatch it back before he gently nudged her hand with his beak. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't move away. Seemed like everyone was holding their breath. Then Eri giggled. It was a small sound and lasted less than a second, but Dark Shadow puffed up in pride and pushed more eagerly into her hand as she started to rub his beak gently. She didn't smile, but her eyes were happy and Fumicage couldn't help smiling slightly as well. Watching her play with Dark Shadow like this was like a bright light in the midst of thick darkness. It was adorable. "All right." Monoma grinned and stood up, grabbing Eri's free hand as he did so. "Now that we all know each other, are you ready to go?" Eri nodded eagerly and squeezed Monoma's hand a little tighter. Dark Shadow stuck close to her, hovering around her shoulders with the same protectiveness he usually showed for Fumicage as they left campus. Fumicage glanced down at Eri and smiled again. Perhaps the world wasn't quite as enshrouded with darkness as it had felt of late. Or perhaps, Fumicage thought as Dark Shadow nudged Eri's cheek playfully, perhaps they were responsible for creating their own light to disperse the shadows. Ochako re-wrapped her wrists and cracked her neck as she squared up for another round with the punching bag. Everyone else had gone to bed a while ago, but even though she'd assured Sue that she was going to bed too, here she was. There was only so much tossing and turning a girl could take before she got frustrated and needed to do something productive. She needed to get some of the energy out, at least, and since no one was awake to spar with her, solo training it was. She grunted as she punched the bag hard enough to make it shake, then wound up and punched it again, imagining it was Shoto or Midoriya or Shigaraki or any villain she could think of. She didn't understand why so many people were siding with the villains these days. Didn't they remember everything the heroes had sacrificed for them? Didn't they even care that there were people out there, risking their lives to keep them safe? It was just so frustrating. How was she supposed to keep people safe from villains who hid in plain sight and toppled heroes left and right? She heard a small hum behind her and whirled around, ready for a fight, only to see an empty room. "Hagakure? Is that you?" She didn't relax as she waited for an answer, lowering herself into a fighting stance as she caught movement in the shadows by the door. She only stood down when Netsu stepped out of the shadows and gave her a smile. "I must apologize. I didn't mean to startle you, young Uraraka." Ochako let out a frustrated sigh as she turned back to her punching bag. "It's all right. I guess I'm kinda high-strung these days. Eventually, I should be able to punch all that nervous energy out, right?" Netsu laughed. "That's the spirit. We need determined heroes like you. What we need is to stop running scared." She growled, resuming her punching routine. If we just disappear into the shadows and refuse to actually fight the villains, we're no better than they are. But quite agree, Nezu said simply. Unfortunately, many heroes only see the evils taking over the world and are blind to their obligation to combat them. I hate it. Ochako emphasized her words with another punch. I just want to get rid of all these stupid villains and have done with it. That's what being a hero is all about. Nezu said, I am very impressed with your efforts recently. You're becoming a promising young hero. Ochako shook out her hands and grabbed her water bottle. I'm trying, I just feel like I haven't been doing enough. The villains always seem to cheat and end up 2 steps ahead while the rest of us are stuck playing catch-up. It's frustrating. It is. Nezu agreed. But for what it's worth, we are proud of your efforts to do so. Ochako felt a tired swell of happiness and took a swig of water. Thank you, Principal Nezu. It means a lot. I'd probably better be getting to bed though. Long day tomorrow. Nezu nodded. Of course. Sleep well, young Uraraka. I'm excited to see what you become. Shoyuta liked the isolation of patrol. His favorite moments had always been when he was perched on a rooftop, overlooking the dark streets and waiting like a cat ready to pounce. With everything that had been on his plate recently, moments like these were rare, so when another hero had announced their retirement that afternoon and was looking for someone to take their shifts, he'd volunteered to take one. Monoma had said that he and Tokoyami were going to visit some friends, but that they'd get her home by her bedtime, so she wouldn't be alone while he was gone. He felt guilty that he hadn't had time to take Eri and show her the city. She didn't deserve to spend any more of her childhood locked up, even if the walls of UA were designed to keep her safe, not keep her in. He was also hoping that Eri might help Tokoyami come out of his shell a little more and vice versa. He didn't know how to stop the other students from pulling away from Tokoyami, especially after what they'd all gone through when Todoroki had joined the League of Villains. They didn't want to get hurt that way again, which Shoyuta could respect, even if he didn't like how they were going about it. But Eri wasn't scared of villains, even when she probably should be, so there was no way she would avoid Tokoyami, no matter what rumors people spread about it. In fact, as much as he hated to admit it, Tokoyami's connection to Hawks and, by extension, the League would probably make her trust him even more. He hoped that it would be a good balance and give her a hero to look up to that wasn't a villain, because she needed more of those. There was a crash a few alleys over and Shoyuta sped across the rooftops in a blur and swung down, kicking someone to the ground and turning to check on the unconscious figure they'd been standing over. To his surprise, he actually recognized the guy on the ground, a repeat offender who had a habit of too many muggings and even more drag charges, but he was even more surprised when he reached for his cuffs and realized the guy already had zip ties on his wrists. He turned back to the other person, who was gripping their chest where Shoyuta had kicked them and chuckling as they got to their feet. Long time no see, Aizawa-sensei. You miss me? Aizawa's eyes narrowed as he took in the person in front of him. They were obviously a vigilante, since they weren't in a designated patrol and he didn't recognize their costume, though he did recognize some aspects of it, and they looked oddly familiar. Shiguro. Shiguro chuckled sadly. Yeah, sorry. Expulsion wasn't enough to kill my dream of being a hero. Would have been easier if it had been, I guess, but oh well. Eraser looked carefully at his former student. He had changed a lot in the past few years, but on closer inspection his bald head and pointed ears made him easy to recognize. Now that Shoyuta knew where they knew each other from, he could see the homages to his first hero costume that Shiguro had incorporated into his vigilante outfit. He'd gotten more confident too, apparently, considering that his tendency to flinch and run away from fights was a large part of what had contributed to his expulsion in the first place. It would have been nice to stay at UA. Shiguro sighed. I honestly thought it was all over. I was too terrified to break the law and go vigilante, but after I figured out I don't need a license anymore, I figured I may as well give it a second chance, right? Shoyuta nodded. He was probably far from the only one to think along those lines in recent months. He gestured to the body on the ground. You did this? Shiguro nodded timidly. Yeah, but, I'm not one of those vigilantes who beat their victims to a bloody pulp or anything. I'm not king. Shoyuta looked at him suspiciously. King? Shiguro laughed. I forgot the police probably don't call them that. But I bet you've heard of them anyway. I don't think they've left a single villain that wasn't immediately rushed to the hospital. Nasty burns, bruises, even a couple broken bones from what I've heard. The rest of us try to avoid them if we can. Shoyuta groaned. He'd heard of that vigilante. They were notoriously violent and antisocial, and when their victims were lucky or unlucky enough to see them, the layer of ash on their face helped them blend in with the shadows and prevented those few criminals from giving a usable description. At first, the police had assumed it was Dabi, but he usually worked with Todoroki these days and there hadn't been ice found at any of the scenes. Besides, Dabi would have just left burned-out corpses, and he didn't punch his victims lights out while he burned them. You called them king, Shoyuta said finally. But is that what they call themselves? Shiguro shrugged. No idea, sorry. They don't talk to anyone, and obviously we try not seek them out, but a couple other vigilantes have heard them grumbling stuff to themselves. And apparently they've said king a few times, so the name just stuck. Shoyuta sighed. Thanks for the info. I can't take you in for excessive force or vigilantism, but you knew that already. Stay safe out there, kid. I hope your second try goes better than your first. Go ahead and rub salt in the wound, why don't you? Shiguro spat out, eyes widening when he realized he'd said that loudly enough for Aizawa to hear. I'm sorry, sensei, I understand. Shoyuta cut him off, pushing away a sense of guilty nausea. I'm the one who expelled you. It's normal to be a bit bitter about that. Shiguro's shoulders slumped in relief. Thanks. And you stay safe too, okay, sensei? Shoyuta nodded. I'll try. Shiguro gave him a shaky smile and Shoyuta let him melt away into the shadows as he called the police to take away the criminal. Expelling students like him had seemed like the right decision at the time, but now Shoyuta couldn't help but wonder how many of his former problem children were doing the same thing as Shiguro was and taking their second chance at heroism. And more importantly, how many of them were going to become vigilantes like King? Monoma frowned as he looked at the menu. An apple pie single scoop in a sugar cone for Eri here. A rainbow sherbet for me and, Tokoyami, I'm assuming you want something as black as your soul? A dark chocolate cherry would be fine. Fumikage nodded, his feathers ruffling slightly in embarrassment. Thank you. Monoma paid for the ice cream, and a few minutes later they were sitting outside on the patio of the shop and liking at the cones as they melted in their hands. Fumikage would occasionally pick one of the cherries out of his ice cream and feed it to Dark Shadow, who gobbled them up appreciatively. Eri shyly held her cone toward him. I can share too. Oh, I'm sorry. Monoma said. I should have thought. Dark Shadow laughed and nudged Eri as he shook his head. Nah, don't worry about it. I like eating occasionally, but too much physical food is no good for us. I get most of my energy from Tokoyami anyway. Dark Shadow does not have a body of his own. Tokoyami explained tiredly. He is an entity of mist and darkness, so rather than slowly converting into a usable form, any food he eats is instantly vaporized into energy. Let's say we figured that out the hard way one Easter. Dark Shadow cackled. How long did those jelly beans keep you awake, Fumikage? Tokoyami's feathers fluffed up again. 3 days that I think. It was a mad banquet of darkness. Oof, talk about a sugar rush. Monoma joked. I bet your parents were real thrilled about that one. They were, Fumikage grimaced, less than enthusiastic. Monoma laughed, but Eri just frowned at her cone. Did you have nice parents or mean ones? Fumikage found himself taken aback. This was such a normal moment, just going out for ice cream, that he'd forgotten she was raised by an abusive villain, if he could even call what that BSRD did. Raising her. She probably didn't even know how parents were supposed to act. He and Dark Shadow shared a panicked moment through their link, wondering how they should respond before Eri spoke up again. Because kids can have both, I think. Eri frowned and took another small lick of her ice cream. Papazawa is nice, but Overhaul was really mean. Grandpa was nice too, I think. But in Tangled, Mother Got Hell acted nice, but was actually mean, so maybe it's hard to tell sometimes. Eri shrugged and went back to focusing on her ice cream as Fumikage stared at her with wide eyes and was aware of Monoma doing the same beside him. Of all the responses he could have expected, one with that level of maturity was not one of them. Maybe he had underestimated how good Aizawa was at parenting. Or maybe Eri had just been forced to grow up too fast. After a long moment of silence, Fumikage cleared his throat. They were nice ones. Eri nodded. Good. Mean parents shouldn't have kids. Monoma nodded in agreement. Yeah, no kid deserves mean parents. It's sad that some parents are mean anyway. Eri turned to look at him. Are your parents mean? They might have been nice if they'd had another son. Monoma smiled sadly. But that's okay, my grandfather made sure they didn't hurt me. So your grandpa was nice? Eri asked. Fumikage watched curiously as Monoma frowned. I can't really say he was nice, because to everyone else he's really mean, but he was nice to me. Eri frowned and Fumikage could tell that she was just as confused as he and Dark Shadow were. She looked like she was about to drop the issue, but after Monoma gave her an encouraging nod, she spoke up again. How does that work? Can someone be nice and man at the same time, or does that mean they're lying? Monoma shrugged. I think it's a little bit of both. Endeavor pretended to be a nice person, but he was mean to Dobby and Freezerburn. But your grandpa was nice, right, Eri? Eri nodded and Monoma smiled. But your grandpa was the head of a yakuza, so he had to be mean at work. Oh, Eri thought about that for a moment, her ice cream melting down her hand. Yeah. I never saw him be mean though. And he wasn't mean to me like Overhaul was. Monoma nodded. Yeah. Sometimes even mean people are nice to the people they care about. That doesn't make them nice people. Like Mastermind isn't a nice person, he'll hurt a lot of people, but he probably won't hurt Freezerburn because he cares about him. Does that make sense? Fumikage nodded. So your grandpa was nice to you, but not other people. That sounds like a bad banquet of darkness. Monoma shrugged. A little, I guess. But it's not like either Eri or I chose to have villains as grandparents, and at least my grandfather kept my parents from hurting me or abandoning me because of my quirk, so there's that. Eri's eyes were wide. You had a villain grandpa too? Yeah, I did. Monoma smiled and ruffled her hair. Actually, I still do, he's just in prison. For now, so I haven't seen him for a while. Oh. Fumikage floundered uselessly. I'm sorry. That's life. Monoma shrugged and finished off the last of his ice cream cone. Is everybody ready? We don't want to be too late. Fumikage and Eri immediately hurried to attack their ice cream cones, but Fumikage didn't really taste it. He couldn't imagine being raised by a villain, but the way that Monoma saw the world was thought-provoking. He didn't see anything inherently bad in the shadows, and managed to still acknowledge the light without glorifying it. It was a breath of fresh air in the stale environment the Hero Commission had created, and it felt terrifying and exhilarating in the same way that flying with hawks for the first time had felt. And if there was anything he'd learned from his internship, it was that birds were meant to fly. Pixie Bob was nervous as the four of them made their way to the location on the map. It wasn't odd to an outside observer, but then again, an outside observer wouldn't know what they were going to find. Well, considering that they didn't know what they were about to find either, maybe that wasn't the best argument, but at least they knew to expect something, well, not quite heroic. They had decided against wearing their hero gear, since seeing the Pussycats in full costume would undoubtedly draw much more attention than they wanted, especially these days, but they all had a few support items at the ready and were prepared to activate their quirks at a moment's notice. Well, those of them who still had them, so maybe that wasn't the best argument either, but anyway, they were going and that was that. Pixie Bob looked at her teammates. They had all been through so much in the past year, with Manari losing her nephew and Ragdoll losing her quirk, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this whatever this was, had probably been building up for longer than any of them cared to admit. Sure, a lot of bad things had happened in the past year, but Mastermind's reign of terror had also exposed a lot of the lies that the hero system was built on, lies that they'd built their entire careers and livelihoods on. Having their foundations torn out from under them like a flimsy tablecloth was devastating, and they were still teetering, trying to keep their balance despite everything, but it was hard. They weren't getting any younger. They'd been heroes for how long? Over 12 years now? And to have that all exposed as a lie. Well, Pixie Bob knew she wasn't the only one who felt robbed. She may not have lost things, Not in the same way as Mandalay and Pixie Bob at least, but that note hadn't been lying when it said that the best years of her life had been stolen from her. She'd given her youth to being a hero, and now that she had a giant scar on her face, she'd given her beauty to it as well. She figured that she was justified in being a little sad. Ragdoll looked at the map again, then at the building in front of them. Really an abandoned building? Are these guys a walking cliché? They probably wanted a neutral location with minimal chance of being observed. Tiger pointed out. Since we're heroes and they're... He let the idea hang out on the open for a moment before Pixie Bob piped up with false cheerfulness. Well, last chance to turn back. Mandalay's face was hard with determination and the anger she was trying to hide with it. No. We've come this far, may as well go forward. They all nodded and made their way into the building. They split up, making sure each room was clear of enemies before regrouping on the roof. They all looked at each other awkwardly before Tiger took out the glow stick that had been hidden alongside the map. Well, this is it. No turning back. Ragdoll took a shaky breath. No turning back. I'm game if you all are. Pixie Bob smiled. Mandalay gave a sharp nod. Let's do this. Tiger nodded and cracked the glow stick in half. The light made the writing stand out ominously, the word promises and all it represented shining like a beacon as the chemicals slowly activated and the glow spread out. Mostly. Pixie Bob grabbed the glow stick. Is there something inside? Ragdoll took it from her. Yeah, there is. It's a feather. Mandalay finished. I think we know who's coming. A voice spoke up from behind them. Did you think I'd slown down just because I don't have the hero commission backing me anymore? The four of them whirled around immediately and Pixie Bob wished that she could say she was surprised when she saw Hawks perching on the edge of the roof, but honestly, now that he was here, she didn't know what else she could have expected. Dobby leaned casually against the wall, next to him, playing with a small flame that jumped between his fingers as he looked across at them. And here I was thinking you guys were too stupid to put it all together. Dobby smirked and the flame in his hand got a little brighter. I guess I'm glad I was wrong. You. Mandalay growled and instantly fell into an attack stance. Down, kitty. I'm not the one who killed your kid or whatever. Dobby rolled his eyes. Muscular went rouge. You can't blame us for that. You brought him. Tiger pointed out. And before you say anything, you explicitly came to attack the students. We came to send a message and get my kid brother away from his abuser. Dobby replied coldly, clenching his fist to extinguish the flame in his hand. Or did you forget about that little detail? Hawks ran to stand in front of Dobby and put his hands up to signal them to them. Now, you can't really believe that the League would actually condone killing a kid like that. Look what we did at Aldera. Pixie Bob stayed in her fighting stance, but she didn't charge and neither did the others. Alright, so you spared the kids then, but you're still a bunch of murderers. And proud of it. Dobby sneered. But you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. Well, you've certainly scrambled up society. Tiger growled. And not for the better either. Debatable. Dobby shrugged. At least we're not glamorizing child soldiers anymore. Hawks pointed out. You can't deny that the Hero Commission put more children in the line of fire than we ever have. Pixie Bob exchanged awkward glances with her teammates. Okay, so maybe he had a point, but there were still a lot of other problems with this arrangement. You stole my quirk. Ragdoll said finally. Or all for one did, but you're the ones that kidnapped me. Alright, we'll own up to that one, but, Dobby smirked, that means that we're in the perfect position to convince Sensei to give it right back, no harm no foul. Of course, that's all presupposing that he isn't behind 15 layers of defense at the time. Same with Muscular. If he's not trapped behind concrete walls, well we don't want him back. Pixie Bob froze as she realized his implications. What? We're heroes. You can't really expect. Hawks shrugged and spread his wings. I was a hero too, but heroes don't really exist anymore. You could even argue that they never really did, what with assholes like Endeavor running around corrupting the title. What's a little jailbreak when society has broken every promise it ever made to us? Dobby grinned. So, what do you say, pussycats? You ready to go after everything you want? Fumikage looked at the warehouse skeptically. Are you sure we're in the right place? I know it doesn't look like much, Monoma assured, but I promise this is where we're supposed to be. Trust me. Fumikage nodded hesitantly, and he saw Eri clutch a little tighter to Monoma's hand as he led them into the darkness. In the time it took for his eyes to adjust, he could feel Dark Shadow panicking, which confused him until he realized that Magna from the League of Villains was the one standing in front of a small clump of gathered teens. He immediately turned on his heel and attempted to head back out the door, only to find Monoma blocking his path. What in the name of darkness? Monoma, what is the meaning of this? Trust me. Monoma put a hand on his shoulder and Tokoyami resisted the urge to brush it away. Believe me, I know exactly how this looks, but think about it. Think about what? Fumikage hissed. His entire body was tense and he shot a suspicious glance toward Magna, who didn't even glance their way despite the fact that she must have seen them. How do you know that this isn't a trap and she's not about to attack us at any moment? Do you really think I would bring Eri someplace if I didn't know for certain that it was safe? Monoma said harshly. Give me some credit, Tokoyami, I'm not an idiot. This is well, it's a neutral space. Everyone here is just trying to figure out what's real and what's right, but to do that, we have to understand both sides. We already understand what the heroes teach, but who would be better to ask about the villain's side of the story than a villain? Fumikage hesitated. He had to admit that Monoma had a point, despite how his entire being was wanting to either run or attack. But the hero's side had fed them propaganda based on a black and white way of thinking, and it was obvious that that wasn't all there was. Things were uglier and more complicated than that, which was something that the villain's side would be much more familiar with than he was. Fine. He spat out. But if things go south, it's on you. He grabbed Eri's hand and Dark Shadow wrapped around her protectively as they stormed over to the group and stood in the back. Monoma followed behind them with a satisfied smile. The meeting, if he could even call it that, was already underway and Fumikage was honestly surprised they hadn't interrupted anything with their whispered argument at the door. The group had about 24 people and was larger than he would have expected, considering that this whole gathering was led by a villain, but maybe most of them had been led here on false pretenses as well. Dark Shadow was tense and it was taking all of Fumicage's self-control to convince his quirk not to attack everyone there in a fit of protective rage, so for the first few minutes whatever Magna was saying went in one ear and out the other. The longer they stayed without being attacked, however, the more he was able to hesitantly relax and actually start paying attention. Whatever villainous rhetoric he was expecting her to spew, however, it wasn't what he got. "What do you want out of your life?" Magna was saying, "Once you know that, it's pretty simple, you go after it. If you want to accomplish something, you learn how to do it. If you want meaningful relationships, you seek out the people who actually accept you. I personally can't think of a better society than one where everyone is actively going after what makes them happy." Fumikage blinked. That made a surprising amount of sense, actually. He was sure that there was some sort of catch, obviously, because these were villains. Their hearts were blackened by greed to the point where they would hurt anyone if given half a chance, so most if not all of what Magna was saying was most likely propaganda designed to recruit more members for the League of Villains. But because it was all just rhetoric and not the League's actual ideas, there was no need for Fumikage to feel bad about cherry-picking the best parts of her speech to learn from. And he obviously wasn't the only one listening carefully. He wasn't surprised that most of the group were teenagers either his own age or a few years older. What was surprising was that there were also adults and even a few middle schoolers and younger in the crowd, though Eri was obviously the youngest one there. One middle schooler kept giving their group weird looks, but Fumikage paid him too much heed. He was used to getting weird looks by this point. Magna had finished her speech and left them to their own discussions, which the weird middle schooler took as an invitation to come talk to them. Fumikage put a hand on Eri's shoulder to steady himself and Dark Shadow tightened protectively around them both as the boy got closer. As much as he knew he and Dark Shadow would have no trouble taking this kid in a fight, he couldn't help registering him as a threat if only because of where they were. Sure, he might look like a harmless middle schooler, but then again, so had Midoriya when he was just starting out. The boy looked down his nose at them with a haughty look on his face that could give Monoma's default expression a run for its money. I didn't know a brat would be coming tonight. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Calm down, Kohi. Monoma warned. We're all after the same things here, right? We all just want to understand. What's there to understand? Kohi scoffed. Those prideful heroes screwed everyone over and now we have to deal with the consequences. Seems pretty simple to me. Fumikage tensed as Magna came up and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Now, don't be unfair. It was mostly the Commission and heroes like Endeavor that did most of the damage. A lot of the heroes like Hawks were victimized just as much as the rest of us were. Tsukuyomi is Hawk's chick, so he should know that even better than most. She turned to face Tokoyami. It's a pleasure to meet ya, kid. I'm Magna. That chicken nugget speaks pretty highly of you, you know. I understand how you must think that a compliment. Fumikage responded coldly. But I would much rather not be associated with such an agent of darkness. Why not? Kohi asked. At least he was brave enough to turn his back on his cozy commission position, which is more than I can say about most hero scum. Magna sighed. You'll have to forgive Mustard here. Apparently his time behind bars did nothing to weaken his strong opinions. Mustard? Fumikage froze as memories flooded him from that night. He could feel Dark Shadow itching to attack as the old fear leaked through the bond and Fumikage almost let him. He didn't know why seeing Mustard was worse than seeing Magna, but the rest of the league had gone on to do other things, however terrible those might be, but Mustard had only appeared on the worst night of Fumicage's life. You're one of the villains that was captured at the summer camp attack. Just got off my parole, Mustard said proudly. Those stupid hero brats didn't even know what hit him. I think you're forgetting that Fumi was one of those hero brats you attacked. Dark Shadow snarled. You almost turned us into a murderer. Stop. Both of you. Monoma stepped between them. Tokoyami, Dark Shadow, we're not here to fight. Mustard, that was uncalled for. Remember who you're speaking to. Apologize. He and Mustard had a stare down for a few tense seconds until Mustard dropped his gaze to the floor. Sorry. He spat. I guess I forgot my place. The tension didn't go away even. When Eri's quiet voice cut through the silence, you hurt Toko and Shadow? Tokoyami felt her rip herself away from him and he almost reached out to her, but he froze when he realized that her horn was glowing brightly. You almost made them hurt people? Eri accused softly. Toko doesn't want to hurt people. Mustard took a step back. What did you say the baby's quirk was again? Something much more dangerous than your pathetic gas. Monoma snapped. He knelt down so that he was on eye level with Eri, but didn't reach out to her. Hey, Eri, it's okay. We're not gonna hurt you, okay? Just take a deep breath. Eri frowned. But Toko and Shadow. What if he? We'll be all right. Dark Shadow interrupted, flexing his wings comically. Fumi and I are big and strong. We can take care of ourselves. What do you think? Fumikage said softly. Can you allow us to embrace the darkness so that you don't have to? Eri hesitated for a long moment, then nodded. Gradually the light faded from her horn and her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Dark Shadow immediately wrapped around her again, humming tunelessly to help her calm down. Fumikage could feel how at war Dark Shadow was with himself. He wanted to protect Eri, but was the best way to do that comforting her and making sure she didn't lose control of her quirk and do something she'd regret, or was the best way to tear Mustard limb from limb until there was nothing left? Well, she was calm now, so they could always attack Mustard later. Fumikage shook his head. No, he couldn't afford to think like that, not if he wanted to be a hero. Perhaps it is time for us to take our leave. Monoma nodded. That's a wonderful idea. Fumikage held out a hand for Eri. She took it gratefully and Dark Shadow didn't unwrap himself from around her until they were safely back inside the gates of UA. You're joking, right? Mandalay asked. You can't actually expect us to help you? Why not? Dobby sneered. It's not like you're doing anything better at the moment. Tiger lunged forward. Why you little? Hawks flew between them. Come on guys. We're all adults here, so let's act like it. He turned to the heroes. Think about it guys. I know this maybe isn't the best situation, but we share the same goals. If you help us, we get our friends back, you get your revenge, and we've got more than enough pull with all for one to make sure he gives back Ragdoll's quirk. It's more mutually beneficial than anything else. What you're proposing would make us villains. Tiger growled. It wouldn't be right. Yeah, well, it's not right to abandon a friend either, is it? Dobby challenged. Or have a kid's death go unavenged, or roll over and give in, but that's what you've been doing, isn't it? You've just given in and become the Commission's little beaches. Mandalay gasped. How dare you? We'll think about it. Ragdoll cut in. Ragdoll! Pixie Bob exclaimed. You can't seriously be thinking. She gave them all a look and they all huddled closer to her. Look, to defeat Dobby and Hawks in our current state, we'd need more backup and support than what we brought, or that we would be able to explain if we called this in. Besides, they made some good points. I'm not saying that it's right or that we should just agree, but we should save this particular battle for another day. Tiger nodded resolutely and turned back to the villains. Very well. We'll consider your proposals. Don't count on anything, though. Hawks gave them all a predatory grin. Of course. Until next time, kitty cats. There was a rush of wind and all of a sudden, the four of them were left alone on the roof. Mandalay took a deep breath and turned back to her team. So? What are we gonna do now? Eri was still awake when Shoyuda got back from patrol. He was absolutely exhausted, but when he'd peeked his head into her room and saw her curled up and staring at the wall, he decided sleep could wait. He knocked on the door. Hey sweetie. Do you mind if I come in? Eri didn't respond, but scooted over on the bed to make room for him, so he took that as permission to come and sit down next to her. He blinked in surprise when, rather than keep him at arm's distance like she sometimes did, she buried herself in his arms as soon as he sat down. Slowly, he started stroking her hair as she nuzzled deeper into his capture weapon. What had happened while he was gone? After a few minutes, Shoyuda cleared his throat. Do you want to talk about it? He felt Eri shake her head, then stop. He waited patiently, careful not to push her despite how worried he was. If she trusted him enough to open up, then that was great, but if she didn't, then forcing her would do more harm than good. Eventually, Eri spoke up softly, her voice muffled by his scarf. Villains hurt Toko, didn't they? Shuda's eyes widened. Yes. They did. Who told you that? Toko didn't like one of the people we met. Eri said. He was so sad and angry and said that they tried to make him hurt people. That's bad, right? Shoyuda nodded and held her a little tighter. Yes, sweetie. It is. Were you okay? Did they try to hurt you? Eri shook her head. No, but Toko, Dark Shadow, and Monoma wouldn't have let them. Is that what you mean when you say that Mastermind-sama hurt people? Shoyuda inhaled sharply, but forced himself to take advantage of the teaching moment Eri had given him. Yes. It is. Eri looked up at him and frowned. That's not nice. No, sweetie. Shoyuda shook his head slowly. No, it isn't. People aren't all good or all bad, but Mastermind has made a lot of people feel just like you're telling me Tokoyami felt today. When they think of him, they get sad and scared. It's not a nice feeling. Oh. Eri thought for a moment. I don't want to make people feel like that. I want to help make them feel better and happy like you and Dark Shadow do, Papa. Shoyuda smiled sadly and kissed her head. That's what being a hero is supposed to mean. Haven't quite gotten there yet. Inko didn't know why she was here. Rei Todoroki was crazy, driven insane by years of abuse from her husband. Even the doctors said so, and Inko had seen it for herself. Only a crazy woman could look at two of her sons turning into murderers and say that she was proud of them. Inko had no reason to go talk to her again. But at the same time, none of the other families she tried apologizing to had even let her in the door. A few had cussed her out from the porch or tried to throw things at her, but the vast majority had simply seen her through the window and refused to even open the door. She didn't blame them. She probably wouldn't want to talk to her either, if she was in their situation, but still, she wished someone would talk to her. Even Mitsuki hated her at this point, even if she wouldn't say so, considering that she hadn't called once since the week Izuku had been arrested. She knew she deserved it for being such a terrible mother, but the fact was that Inko Midoriya was lonely. hence why she was walking through the halls to the room of the only person who was willing to actually talk to her, no matter how crazy that person was. Maybe the isolation was making Inko as crazy as she was. She knocked lightly before pushing open the door. "Hello, Ray? I was wondering if it was all right if She trailed off as she realized that Ray wasn't actually alone. I can come back later if it's not a good time." Ray just smiled. "It's always a perfect time, Inko, come on in. I know that you know about Tuya and Shudo, but have you met my other two children? These two are Fuyumi and Natsuo, my middle children. Fuyumi, Natsuo, this is Inko Midoriya, Izuku's mother." "Oh." The boy, Natsuo, waved to her awkwardly. Hey. "Natsuo, don't be impolite." Fuyumi, the girl, scolded. "I'm sorry about him. It's a pleasure to meet you." She seemed like a sweet girl and Inko gave her a sad smile. "Likewise. I wish it were under better circumstances." "Really?" Natsuo scoffed. "You really want to go through an awkward meet-the-parents dinner while Shudo and his boyfriend try not to attack each other's faces for 2 whole hours? Believe me, this is preferable." Inko stammered and looked toward Ray for some help, but she only laughed. "I'm sure it wouldn't have been all that mad, Natsu." Ray chuckled. "I'm sure that Shudo and Izuku would have been very polite if we'd all gotten to have dinner together." "Hey," Natsuo cut in thoughtfully, "do you think that if that dinner had happened before the old man kicked the bucket that they would have killed him before dessert? It would have been dinner and a show." Inko gasped and Fuyumi slapped her brother upside the head. "Natsuo, you can't just say something like that." "What?" Natsuo laughed. "You can't say that it wouldn't have been entertaining." "Well, no, it would have been, but that's besides the point." Fuyumi insisted. "Most people don't joke about their father being murdered." Natsuo rolled his eyes. "Yeah, well, most fathers don't neglect half their children while training the others half to death, so I don't think we're really normal." "Aren't you angry?" Inko just couldn't wrap her head around any of this. They were joking about her son's crimes like his part in their father's death was just another Tuesday. "I know he wasn't the best man, but he was still your father. Don't you hate your brothers and my son for what they did?" "Hate them?" Natsuo scoffed. "Why would I hate them for doing something I've been thinking about doing myself since I was 8? But Inko looked toward Fuyumi, who shrugged. "I wouldn't have put it quite so harshly," she sighed, "and I feel guilty even saying it, but Natsuo has a point. What Tuya and Shudo did was evil, obviously, but well, I can't blame them for wanting him dead, as terrible as that sounds. And the world is probably better without him. I teach elementary school, and if any of my students were going through what he put us through, I don't know what I'd do." "It's all right if you don't feel the same way," Ray said kindly, grabbing her hand. "I understand we're a bit strange, but we don't hate your son. Or you." Inko inhaled sharply and she couldn't help spilling a few Midoriya tears at the words. She shouldn't be happy about this. This family was crazy, but had anyone told her they didn't hate her since Izuku was arrested? It had been rare even before that, what with giving birth to a quirkless child, and as much as she hated where it was coming from, she couldn't help her natural reaction to the acceptance. It was nice. She chuckled wetly and wiped away the tears as best she could. Sorry. You said you teach elementary school, Fuyumi? What's that like?" "We're gonna get caught," Spinner pointed out. "Oh, come on, that's half the fun." Compress sounded delighted. "Rubbing it in the heroes' faces that they can't catch us? Delicious. Plus, maybe this one will go viral too," Shudo said, waving his phone in Spinner's face. "Izuku will be so proud." "Can you really say that it went viral if it got taken down 20 times? Talk says 19. Dabi grinned. "Remember that one of those times Shiggy just accidentally deleted it. I thought it was an old game file." Shigaraki scowled. "It was redundant data. Old versions should be deleted." "But seriously? Making videos?" Spinner shook his head. "I mean, it's fun, don't get me wrong, but why? It humanizes us." Magna said, "I've been talking to a lot of the kids that attend my meetings and their parents, teachers, everyone has been trying to convince them that villains are just monsters. Mastermind did a bit to show that wasn't the case, but we've still got a long way to go. Sure, Shudo posting a stupid video of stair sledding might have been a bit ridiculous, but it shows that even if we've done some bad things, we aren't evil. Or do you really want to go back to a society where everything tries to be black and white even though that's not the way the world works? I guess that makes sense, Spinner said, but why a parking garage? It fits the aesthetic, Toga said, bouncing down the final set of stairs. And there's so many places to hide. Do you know how many people have bled out in parking garages? Why do I get the feeling that you're responsible for some of those? Dobby said dryly. Come on, let's get this over with. Pretty bird, you're on camera. I mean, you're basically just a drone, right? Hawks glared at him. You realize I'm a bird of prey, right? I could literally control the camera with one feather. Do feathers even register on touchscreens though? Shudo asked. I mean, if they do, then does that mean the companies expect a lot of birds to be using their phones? Don't trust the birds. Twice yelled. That's so cool. Tell me more. Shudo laughed as Hawks and Dobby started arguing and wouldn't stop until Shigaraki threatened to dust them both. He wished Izuku could be here, but somehow he didn't think his boyfriend would want him just moping around while he was gone, and the more people they got on their side, the easier it would be to get him out of prison and keep him out. Show! Dobby yelled. Get over here. We need an ice slide. Coming! Shudo ran to help and started following Toga's directions for where to put his ice. He might miss Izuku right now, but Shudo hoped he'd at least found some way of entertaining himself while stuck in Tartarus. Shoyuda was 90% sure Midoriya was using them as a form of entertainment. The press wasn't allowed to talk to him and none of the heroes or detectives had brought him any news of the outside world, so it wasn't like he was getting anything out of accepting their visits, but every time Shoyuda came, the kid was just sitting there, smiling through the glass like he didn't have a care in the world. Hello, Eraserhead. Midoriya was the same as always, looking relaxed as if there weren't guns in the wall that would kill him without hesitation if he made one wrong move. How's Eri doing? Do you really think I'm going to answer that question when I haven't ever answered it before? Shoyuda deadpanned. Isn't the definition of insanity doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result? Oh, but I am getting different results. Midoriya answered gleefully. I'm glad she's doing better. I know you were worried about her idolizing me. What changed? Shoyuda had to school his expression to hide the shock, but based on Midoriya's smug smile, he'd seen it anyway. He'd gotten all that just from watching Shuda's body language? Well, he supposed that there was always the possibility that someone had told him, but Shoyuda hadn't told anyone about his conversation with Eri, so either they had a much larger security leak than they wanted to believe, or Midoriya was trying to get under his skin. He'd have to investigate both possibilities later. Nothing's changed for you, it seems. Shoyuda replied. Nedzu says he's still beating you at chess. Most of the time. Midoriya shrugged. But you learn just as much by losing, you know that, Eraserhead. How much did you learn from losing your friend back in high school? Shoyuda took a deep breath. It wasn't the first time a villain had brought up Shirakumo in an attempt to throw him off, about as much as you learned from losing your friendship with Bakugo back in elementary school. A scowl crossed Midoriya's face momentarily and Shoyuda gave a small smile. He still wasn't in the lead, they weren't even, but Shoyuda had won a point in whatever game Midoriya was trying to play and that was worth something at least. After a second, Midoriya laughed. Then I guess you learned to look out for yourself too. Maybe you're not so bad after all, Eraserhead. I don't know about that. Shoyuda replied smoothly. I'm still a hero. When Ochako had asked Nedzu for permission to pick up some patrols, she hadn't been expecting him to actually say yes, but she was delighted that he did. Even getting permission for Tsu to come along hadn't been much of an issue, though when Aizawa heard about it, he insisted that daytime patrols would draw too much attention, so they'd been stuck with an early morning shift just before sunrise. It was slow and Uraraka felt like she should be doing more, but it was better than endlessly sparring with a punching bag, so she'd take it for now. Hopefully soon she'd be able to convince everyone that someone had to patrol during the day. It wasn't like they could just leave civilians unprotected just because they were afraid of becoming targets. They had an hour until sunrise when Tsu sniffed at the air. Do you smell something burning? Ribbit? Ochako sniffed the air as well. I mean, it's faint, so it might be those trash cans the homeless people use, but we should check it out anyway. Let's go. Tsu nodded and hopped behind her as Uraraka canceled her own gravity and jumped over the rooftops toward the smell. That was when they heard the banging dot and the begging. Stop! The victim's voice sounded desperate, but was getting weaker with every word. I can't that I'll be better why are you please? She and Tsu exchanged a look and immediately picked up their pace. Ochako growled as she pushed herself harder. Come on, Froppy. Faster. We have to save him. Be careful. Tsu croaked. We don't know who's down there. It could be Dabi. Or even Freezerburn. I'd actually love to fight Todoroki without his little boyfriend around to protect him. Ochako huffed. We're due for a rematch after the movie theater. They reached the alley in record time and dropped down just as a hooded shadow disappeared between the buildings. Ochako immediately gave chase. Stop, villain. Get back here. Ochako! Tsu's cry made her lose her stride. What is it? Ochako snapped. They're getting away. This guy needs medical attention. Now. Tsu said. Sure enough. Now that Ochako took a moment to look, the guy on the ground looked to be in bad shape. He was huge, so whoever took him down must have been powerful, but they definitely hadn't gone easy on him, considering that he was barely conscious and kept trying to push Tsu away like she was going to hurt him. Tsu looked up at her. I can't lift him. We need to get him to the hospital. Ochako grit her teeth. She could just barely see the shadow making its way onto the rooftops. If she didn't give chase now, she'd lose them. She glanced back at the victim and cursed. You call the hospital and tell them we're on our way. I'll clean the worst of the burns so we can move him. She'd catch the villain that did this, she would. But heroes weren't supposed to just fight villains. True heroes did what they had to do to keep people safe. Katsuki kept a wary eye on Uraraka all morning, but either she hadn't recognized him or she just didn't care. Like, she had no right to tell him that he shouldn't be out patrolling if she and Frogface were doing the same thing, but at the same time, she'd taken a page from Death Arm's book and called him a villain, which was really pissing him off. He wasn't a goddamn villain. He was just putting some villain scum in their place, and it wasn't like he was hurting them more than they deserved or anything, but after how Kirishima had reacted to just learning he'd picked on Deku a few times, he didn't trust that his classmates would see it that way. They'd probably get on him just for going out in the first place, even though there were no laws against it right now, and he just didn't want to deal with all that noise. Too bad the entire FNG class seemed determined to annoy him. Somehow Mina had gotten it into her head that the stupid girl power duo had had a run-in with a villain last night, even though that's not what had happened at all, and was now needling them incessantly for all the nitty-gritty details. If Katsuki thought it'd get him anything besides glares, he'd explode the table and order her to shut up, but as it was, that'd be pointless, so he just had to grit his teeth and do anger management or whatever. Wonderful. Come on. Mina whined again. Tell us everything. If you met a villain, we want to know. We didn't meet a villain. Tsu frowned. Only because he ran away like a coward. Uraraka huffed. The least he could have done is stay and fight after leaving us to clean up his mess. Katsuki clenched his fists beneath the table. It was taking everything in his power not to punch her in the face right now. He didn't leave a mess, he left a villain for the police. And if she wanted a fight, he'd give her one. Just get a sports festival rematch and he'd show her what a coward really was when he had her screaming and begging for mercy like that stupid thug last night. She'd stand about as much of a chance against him as that loser had. You heard what Aizawa said. Tsu said calmly. King isn't officially classified. As a villain, technically. Fine. Uraraka rolled her eyes. Vigilante then. Still beat a guy half to death. Even after he woke up, he was too terrified to say anything. Sounds a hell of a lot like a villain to me. Is that what they were calling him now? Seemed like a pretty badass name to him. They were acknowledging that he was the best. He was better than all those other heroes and vigilantes, and he was definitely better than Deku's stupid army of villains. Of course he was the king of the streets. Katsuki ducked his head and smirked as he picked at his food. Of course the guy was too chicken to say anything, served him right for being a FING villain. So what if Roundface was an idiot and couldn't accept true power when she saw it? He was better than her and better than Deku, and someday everyone would know it. Dark Shadow tucked himself around Fumikage and peered at the phone over his shoulder. He wasn't quite sure why the League of Villains had started making ridiculous videos, but it was kind of unfair. Here Fumikage was having to deal with his hero classmates who alienated him because of something that hadn't even happened yet, and the villains were off having fun and bonding. Fumikage didn't deserve to be alone. Neither did the villains, but it was still really annoying that they got to have those close friendships and Fumikage was stuck eating lunch alone in a tree. If it wasn't the League, Dark Shadow would even be tempted to be jealous. Fumikage pressed replay again. The video didn't have any substance, it was just silly, but Dark Shadow could feel how sad it was making him and butted against his cheek. Hey, you wanna go visit Eri? Or maybe that Monoma kid? Don't forget you always have me. Fumikage sighed and gave him a small smile. You're right, Dark Shadow. I am still not completely eclipsed by the darkness of solitude as of yet. I just thought, well, at times I forget that the sunlight of friendship must shine again. I did not mean to offend. I could never forget you. Dark Shadow wrapped himself a little tighter. It's all good, I know. I know. Shoyuta stayed behind after the staff meeting and waited until all the other teachers had left before walking up to Nedzu. I have some concerns about my students. It felt weird saying he had concerns about his students. Of course he had concerns about his students. They'd had one of their classmates turn villain and another few drop out, all while trying to adjust to the fact that their plans for the future had been turned entirely on their heads. Of course they were having issues, it was ridiculous to think they wouldn't. The fact remained, though, that he was their teacher and it was his responsibility to help them the best he could. Nedzu nodded and gestured for him to sit back down. Of course. Your students have been through quite a bit in the past year or so, haven't they? You can say that again. Shoyuta groaned. And I thought I had it bad when I was a student. So, Nedzu took a sip of tea. Which students are worrying you? All of them. Shoyuta muttered. Ugh, but let's start with Bakugo. I'm sure you know he's been disappearing sometimes, mostly at night. Technically, it's not against the rules, since we can't hold the students hostage or anything, but it's still concerning. 1, because I have no idea if he's just walking around or if he's being a public nuisance, and 2, because a kid his age needs sleep and Bakugo's sleep schedule used to be the healthiest in the class. Ah. Nedzu said. Yes, I understand why you would be concerned. What do you propose? Well, I want to talk to the kid, Shoyuta said, but I've already tried that and he avoided the question like the plague, which didn't make me any less concerned, obviously. I even made the mistake of calling his parents, but they seemed terrified of the kid and I didn't want to push and make things worse. Thank you for bringing me your concerns. Nedzu said. For now, it seems like the most logical course of action is to keep an eye on the situation and perhaps push more as it progresses. But of course, you already knew that. That doesn't mean I have to like it. Shoyuta complained. My next problem student is Uraraka. Really? Nedzu took another sip of tea. I would have thought she would be the least of your worries. She's been making massive strides recently in her training. That's what worries me. Shoyuta glared at him. You know how I got after Shirakumo died. I poured everything I had into training, just to numb the pain, and pushed everyone away. Uraraka's doing the same thing I did, except on steroids. At this rate, she's going to either burn herself out, burn all her bridges, or both. Oh, I'm not too worried. Nedzu said, waving away his concerns. Children are quite resilient, you know. Perhaps she'll surprise you. Shoyuta stopped and stared at him. You're joking, right? Quite the contrary. Nedzu returned his gaze calmly. I believe that if Mastermind's rapid rise to power has taught us anything, I think it is that the youth are capable of so much more than we think. It's a trauma response. Shoyuta argued. She's doing all this to numb the pain instead of processing everything the Hell class has been through in the past year. It's unhealthy. Perhaps you should trust your students more, Eraser. Nedzu countered. How are you ever to expect them to grow into capable young heroes if you second-guess all their decisions? Yuta froze as things clicked into place. You're encouraging this. Nedzu shrugged. I always encourage my students to do their best, you know that. He shook his head. No, it's more than that. You're the one that gave her permission to patrol without a supervising hero. What are you even trying to accomplish? You really think I would have ulterior motives when it comes to my own student body? Nedzu sounded genuinely offended. I am simply trying to do what's best for my students and for society at large. That involves leading them in certain directions to help them fulfill their full potential, then it is my duty as an educator to do so. Society? What are you even? Shuta's eyes widened in horror. You're making her into another Hawks. Don't be ridiculous. Nedzu rolled his eyes. I am making her into what society needs. And what society needs right now is hope. Aizawa knew he should feel angry. He did feel angry, but right now it was buried under a thick blanket of numb shock. You're making her into a target. I'm making her into a hero. Nedzu said firmly. And it is not as if I am forcing her down this path. Every step she has taken so far, she has taken on her own. I'm simply making sure the path is clear for her. I do not know why you are wasting so much energy trying to convince yourself that I'm the villain when the League is still out there, poisoning the hearts and minds of the next generation. Now, shouldn't you be off helping guide your students into heroic paths? The dismissal was clear and Yuta found himself standing and leaving the principal to his strategies as he had the sinking realization that villains weren't the only ones with access to poison. Aoyama blinked at the outfit he'd been given to put on and knew that his glitter had become a bit less dazzling than usual. Dropping out of UA had been the right decision, of course, and he had not regretted it once. With his natural beauty and flawless face, it had not taken long to sign a modeling contract, a much preferable career that would allow him to dazzle the public with his natural sparkle without drawing dangers to his light like moths, and he had been even more successful than he had planned. But, of course, his journey to the spotlight had barely begun, so he couldn't afford to be a prima donna, which was highly unfortunate considering the designer's most recent outfit choice. He held the hanger at arm's length. What did you say your inspiration was, monsieur? Heroes and villains. The designer grinned and snapped his sketchbook shut. It's a perfect and timely blend of politics and art, don't you think? It's thought-provoking. Are the heroes really heroes? Are the villains really villains? What if the villains had been the heroes all along and vice versa? Isn't it exciting? Of course. But Aoyama couldn't take his eyes off the outfit. The black suit could almost pass as casual for daily wear, but the mask-like collar attached was clearly in homage to the symbol of evil himself. Don't you think it's in poor taste, mon ami? Glorifying a murderer like this? The shock factor is exactly what will make our collection memorable on the runway. The designer insisted. And what people remember, people buy. Besides, villain merch has been all the rage these days. Vogue even did an article about it. Now go out there, strut your stuff and show everyone what true power is. Aoyama bit his lip, but the designer walked away to scold another model. Before he had the chance to say anything else, he looked at the outfit again. It really wasn't ugly now that he'd had a moment to adjust and he was just the model, right? It wasn't like he had to support what he was wearing, just make it look très magnifique. He sighed and made his way behind the curtain to change. This was going to make for an interesting showcase. Are we sure about this plan? Pixie Bob asked. Like, I want revenge the same as all of us, I totally do, but we gotta be sure, because once we go down this path that there's no coming back from this, guys. There's no coming back from death either. Mandalay snapped. The League is willing to murder, lie, steal, manipulate, anything to get their way. Do you really think we stand a chance against them if we stay all high and mighty? Grow up. Now, Mandalay, she wasn't trying to argue with that. Tiger said calmly. Someone will have to sully themselves to make sure these monsters are destroyed, but the question still remains of whether it should be us. I don't have anything left to lose. Ragdoll's quiet voice made them all stop. I don't have my quirk. I don't have a career. I'm lumped in with Mastermind for God's sake. I'm already going down, but I at least want to drag them down with me before I hit rock bottom. There was silence for a moment as they all processed that, then Pixie Bob grinned savagely. They ruined us first, right? We're just returning the favor. It's not going to be easy. Tiger said. Muscular, of course, will be simple. The league already said they aren't going to get in the way of that one, but Mastermind? Kurogyri? Shigaraki? Even the timing of allowing All for One to return Ragdoll's quirk before killing him will be a nightmare, not to mention actually figuring out how to dig in the knife. But we're a team, Ragdoll pointed out. We always have been. We'll figure it out together. Lock onto our targets with sparkly gazes, Mandalay began. Ragdoll gave a small smile. We've come to lend a claw and rip. Turning out of nowhere, Tiger growled. Startlingly dangerous and cat-like. Pixie Bob said. They were all wearing matching grins of determination as they reached for each other's hands. The wild pussycats. Even with all the confusion it caused, having a neutral default facial expression was sometimes really convenient. Sue might have been almost more nervous than she had been at the UA entrance exam, but to anyone else, it would look like she was having a normal day. It was a normal day, actually, which was why they had decided to do this now. Normal days were few and far between. Kaminari wrung his hands nervously, too expressive to be able to hide it like Tsu could. Are we sure we want to do this? I mean, interventions never go very well in movies. It's not an intervention. Ida tried. We are simply pointing out our friend's self-destructive tendencies and letting her know we're here to help. That's the definition of an intervention. Ida. Shinso pointed out. But I'm with Kaminari. Is being a good hero really that bad? I mean, that's what we're all trying to do, right? There's kinda a difference between being a good hero and whatever Uraraka's doing, man. Kirishima said. Only getting 3 hours of sleep a night because you're too busy training and patrolling isn't manly. I only get 3 hours of sleep a night. Shinso deadpanned. Yeah, but you've got insomnia. That's different. Jiro rolled her eyes. And let's be honest, you were the one that pointed out that Uraraka gets less sleep than you do sometimes. Shinso groaned. Fine, you might have a point. She's a hard worker, though, you have to admit that. What's the problem? Mina hit him in the arm. She's gonna burn herself out, that's the problem. Plus, you know she's been getting more media attention recently. A heavy silence fell over the room as they all thought about that. After the car chase incident, the media had been picking up on the mystery hero student, heralding her strength and willingness to do whatever it took to protect civilians. Tsu knew they were just trying to give people hope by convincing people that there were still heroes and that the next generation was going to rise up to protect them from Mastermind and the League, but they weren't just calling the attention of civilians at this point. No, everyone knew that it wouldn't be long before all the attention attracted the villains as well. They were running out of time. Kirishima swallowed nervously. When's she coming again? I think she was supposed to be back here at the dorms 20 minutes ago. Actually, according to her usual schedule. Yayarozu said. I hope she's all right. She had a meeting with Nedzu. Tsu said. He caught her in the hallway at lunch and set it up, but she promised me it'd be quick, so she should be around soon. Unless Nedzu goes into assembly mode. Kaminari muttered. In which case it'll be another 2 hours. Everybody shut up. Jiro's earphone jacks swiveled in the air. I think she's coming. Tsu swallowed down a nervous croak and everyone tried to look at least somewhat natural as Ochako walked in. Once upon a time, before the League or Mastermind, she would have had a bounce in her step, she would have maybe even been smiling, but now when she walked in, she just looked harsh. Her shoulders were slumped and she looked ready for a fight, but the sad part was that it wasn't any different than how she looked every other day. This was her new normal. A cold galactic void, rather than a bright star. Both were strong, dangerous, and beautiful, but Tsu just wanted her friend to get some of that old light back. They all did. When she saw everyone gathered in the common room, Ochako stopped and gave them a tired smile. Hey guys, what's up? I thought movie night wasn't until Friday. Actually, we were hoping to talk to you. Yayarozu's voice was tight as she forced herself to sound cheerful. Come sit down. Sure. Ochako came over hesitantly. Is something wrong? Tsu could practically imagine what she was thinking. She knew something was wrong, but she was probably assuming it was a villain attack, or at least something she could attack and fix. They could only hope she didn't completely shut them all out after she figured out the truth. Sue didn't think she'd be able to handle it if that happened, not on top of everything else. Well, kinda, Mina said hesitantly. When's the last time you took a break? Ochako frowned. What do you mean? We all ate lunch together, right? Not just lunch or something. Kirishima said. Like, you've been working super hard and it's really manly, but we just want to make sure you're taking time for you too, you know? My workouts are my me time. Ochako looked around the room. They're how I recharge. Are you this an intervention? Not really. Kaminari made a face. Okay, kinda? Maybe? I mean just a little. Jiro rolled her eyes. Yes. Okako groaned. I can't believe this. I'm fine, guys. Sue, you know I'm fine. Why did you let them do this? It was her idea. Ida said. We just want what's best for you. What's best for me is to have friends that actually trust me. Ochako whirled around to look at her. Sue, is that really true? Yes. Sue half wished she wasn't always so blunt. At least if she had a little more tact, Ochako wouldn't look so betrayed right now. You're stressed. We all are. And we're all trying to deal with that in our own ways, but if you keep running like this, you're going to get hurt. Ochako's glare hardened. Getting hurt is part of being a hero. You see that? Jiro groaned. Can you even hear yourself right now? That mindset isn't healthy. Yeah, man. Kirishima agreed. Like, you can't just go into fights assuming that getting hurt is okay, especially right now. It would be one thing if it's a broken leg or, like, a scratch or something, but villains these days are aiming to kill. And we promised to be willing to lay down our lives when we decided to become heroes. I don't get why you're all freaking out over something we all agreed to. If you're not okay with it, there's the door. You wouldn't be the first dropouts. We don't want to drop out, Uraraka. Ida insisted. But you can't just charge in blindly. There's certain risks and you have to consider your own safety as well as that of others. With all the attention you've been getting. Oh, so that's what this is about. Ochako scoffed. You think that just because I've had a couple articles written about me, I'm gonna be, what? The next endeavor or something? I'm just a student, guys, but even if I were that important, why should I scurry to hide under a rock at the first sign of danger? We're supposed to be heroes, not cowards. Having common sense doesn't make you a coward. Kirishima yelled. Look, man, we just don't want to see you get hurt. At the rate you're going, you're gonna burn yourself out and then what? I'm not weak. Ochako said. I can handle it. And the people deserve to be safe. Don't you deserve to be safe too? Sue asked half-heartedly. If society being safe comes at the price of your health, then it's worth it. Ochako snapped. Are you saying that any one of your lives is worth more than all of Japan? Are you really willing to let all those people suffer in fear every single day, just so you can be a little lazy sometimes? Hey! Kaminari squealed. That's not. I'm done with this. Ochako scoffed and rolled her eyes as she turned away. No wonder no one was able to replace All Might. Sue's stomach sank with dread and several of her classmates gasped as they tried to wrap their heads around what Ochako was implying. There was a reason everyone had done away with the hero rankings after Hawks fell. No one was meant to sit in the cursed throne. Ochako, Yayarozu's voice broke. Please. The people still need heroes. Ochako said firmly. That's what I'm going to be. So the rest of you can either get your acts together and be strong enough to save them, or do us all the favor and stay the F out of my way. She stormed up the stairs and Sue could only stare after her. She'd just come out of a meeting with Nedzu. Why hadn't he said anything? He was the principal. He should know better than anyone that Ochako couldn't keep going like this, so why did Sue get the sinking feeling that he was encouraging it? Well, Shinso said, that could have gone better.